Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me tonight, ready to slow down, to breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift across centuries to a world where the Mediterranean wasn't just a sea, but a highway of hope, danger, and possibility. This is your moment to leave behind the weight of today, to step away from whatever keeps your mind racing, and step gently onto the salt-worn deck of a medieval merchant ship, feeling the creak of oak planks beneath your feet, hearing the snap of canvas sails catching wind, smelling the peculiar mix of tar and spices and seawater that defined life for the brave souls who crossed this ancient sea, carrying the world's treasures from port to distant port. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through a forgotten way of life that shaped our modern world more than most realize. We stand beside merchants who risked everything on a single voyage, navigators who read stars with practiced eyes, sailors who knew every mood of wind and wave, cooks who made magic from dried fish and hard biscuit in a tiny galley that rolled and pitched with every swell. We imagine the moment the lookout spots land after days of empty horizon, the relief and excitement that runs through every soul aboard, the knowledge that they've survived another crossing, that home or fortune or simply another day of life awaits in the harbour ahead. Each episode here isn't just about maritime history or trade routes mapped in old books. It's not about memorising ship designs or cargo manifests or the names of long-forgotten ports. It's about the lives lived in that narrow wooden world between sky and sea, the courage required to trust your life to wind and timber, the bonds formed when survival depends on every person aboard doing their part, the quiet moments watching dolphins race the bow or stars wheel overhead in patterns older than memory. It's about the beauty they found in harsh conditions, the mysteries of distant shores, the human need to connect and trade and share that drove them across waters that could kill them without warning. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen, drift, and dream of distant horizons. Close your eyes and imagine the Mediterranean Sea in the year 1273. When the world was younger and the distance between Venice and Alexandria felt infinite, measured not in miles but in weeks of uncertainty, prayer, and the mercy of winds that might blow fair or foul or not at all. This wasn't the Mediterranean of cruise ships and luxury resorts. This was a working sea, dangerous and unpredictable, where fortunes rose and fell with each voyage, where a single storm could send a merchant's entire investment to the bottom in minutes, where pirates lurked in rocky coves and hostile fleets patrolled waters they claimed as their own. Yet it was also a sea of extraordinary opportunity, connecting civilizations that had traded across these waters since before Rome rose, before Athens dreamed of democracy, before Phoenician sailors first ventured beyond sight of land with hearts pounding and prayers on their lips. The medieval Mediterranean was a crossroads of three continents, three great religious traditions, dozens of languages and cultures and kingdoms all jostling for position, for power, for profit. Christian Europe looked south and east with a mixture of desire and suspicion. The Islamic world controlled vast territories from Spain to Syria, their merchants sophisticated and wealthy beyond European imagination. The Byzantine Empire, ancient heir to Rome itself, guarded the gateway between Mediterranean and Black Sea, controlling trade routes that had enriched Constantinople for centuries, and threading through all this political complexity, these religious tensions, these competing claims of territory and power, sailed the merchant ships. They were the blood vessels of medieval commerce, carrying Syrian glass and Egyptian cotton, Venetian mirrors and Florentine wool, Greek wine and North African grain, spices from the far Indies that had travelled overland for months before even reaching Mediterranean ports. They carried Jewish merchants fleeing persecution, Muslim scholars seeking new libraries, Christian pilgrims heading to Jerusalem, craftsmen looking for work, slaves being transported to new markets, ideas and technologies and stories that would reshape the world. The ships themselves were marvels of medieval engineering, built without detailed plans by craftsmen who learned their trade from fathers and grandfathers, who knew by eye and hand and experience how to shape oak planks into vessels that could survive the Mediterranean's moods. They were called by many names depending on their design and origin: round ships and cogs, galleys and tarriders, each adapted to different purposes, different trade routes, different philosophies of how best to move goods and people across an often hostile sea. Most merchant ships of this era were what we'd call small by modern standards, perhaps 60 to 80 feet in length, propelled primarily by a single large square sail that caught the wind and pulled them forward when conditions were right, supplemented sometimes by oars when they needed to manoeuvre in harbours, or when the wind died and left them drifting on glassy swells under merciless sun. These weren't fast ships by any measure. A voyage from Genoa to Acre might take 6 weeks in good conditions, twice that if weather turned against them. If they had to shelter from storms in unfamiliar harbours, if pirates forced them to run or fight, if contrary winds kept them tacking back and forth for days making minimal progress toward their destination. The cargo hold was everything on a merchant vessel, the reason for the ship's existence, the source of profit or loss that would determine whether the investors prospered or faced ruin. It was a dark, cramped space below deck where goods were packed with obsessive care, heavy items low to maintain stability, fragile cargo cushioned and protected, everything lashed down to prevent shifting in rough seas, which could capsize a vessel as surely as any storm. The smell down there was complex and overwhelming, a mixture of whatever cargo they carried, bilge water that collected despite constant pumping, tar used to seal seams, the general mustiness of a wooden space that never truly dried, that breathed and creaked with every wave, that held the essence of every voyage, every cargo, every desperate prayer uttered when the ship rolled too far and took too long to right herself. Above this hold, the deck was the stage where life unfolded during the voyage, a space perhaps 20 feet wide and 60 feet long, where crew and passengers lived, worked, argued, prayed, cooked, slept, and watched the horizon for land or danger, or the dark line of an approaching storm. It was never still, always moving, rising and falling with the endless rhythm of waves, tilting as the ship heeled before the wind, slick with spray when the sea was up, burning hot under summer sun, freezing in winter gales when water that came aboard turned to ice before it could drain through the scuppers. And beyond the deck in every direction stretched the sea itself, sometimes blue and sparkling and deceptively gentle, sometimes grey and angry and towering in waves that made strong men weep and pray, sometimes utterly calm and mirror-flat, leaving the ship motionless for days while food and water supplies dwindled and tempers frayed. The Mediterranean was smaller than the great oceans, but it was deep enough and wide enough and moody enough to kill you if you didn't respect it, if you took chances, if you trusted fair weather to last or believed you could outrun a gathering storm. This was the world into which our story sails, a world where courage and commerce intertwined, where every voyage was an act of faith, where the line between success and disaster could be measured in a sudden shift of wind, a chance encounter with raiders, a captain's decision to press on or shelter, to trust his instincts or follow established routes. It was a hard world, but it was also a world of extraordinary human achievement, of connections forged across cultural divides, of the slow, patient work of building the networks and knowledge and trust that would eventually bind the Mediterranean world into something resembling a single economic system. The stage is set, the ship waits at the dock, cargo loaded and tied down, crew assembled, passengers nervously finding their places, the captain checking the sky one last time before giving the order to cast off. Let us board and see what life was truly like for those who dared to make their living on the medieval Mediterranean's restless waters. For centuries, the reality of life aboard medieval merchant ships remained locked in the depths, buried in silt and sand and the accumulated debris of time, known only through fragmentary references in legal documents, cargo manifests, and the occasional romantic tale told by those who survived to old age and wanted to remember the sea as kinder than it truly was. Then, in the summer of 1967, a team of marine archaeologists working off the coast of southern Turkey made a discovery that would change everything we thought we knew about medieval maritime life. At a depth of nearly 150 feet, in waters so clear you could see the ancient timbers lying on the seabed like the skeleton of some great wooden whale, they found what would become known as the Limina shipwreck, a merchant vessel that sank sometime around the year 1025, going down with its entire cargo, its equipment, its tools, and the personal possessions of everyone aboard. What made this discovery extraordinary wasn't just the ship itself, though that was remarkable enough, but what it carried. The excavation, conducted over multiple seasons with painstaking care, revealed 3 tons of broken glass, cullet destined for recycling, along with intact glass vessels of stunning beauty, ceramic bowls and amphora, weapons including swords and a soldier's armour, fishing weights and hooks, a set of Byzantine gold coins, carpenter's tools, navigational instruments, cooking equipment, even gaming pieces carved from bone that someone had carried aboard to pass the long hours at sea. Every artifact told a story. Every corroded nail and rotted rope fragment and shard of pottery added another detail to our understanding of how these ships actually functioned, how people actually lived in the cramped confines of a working merchant vessel, crossing dangerous waters far from any hope of rescue if things went wrong. Other discoveries followed as underwater archaeology advanced, and new technologies allowed researchers to explore deeper and more systematically. The Asiada shipwrecks off Turkey revealed Byzantine-era merchant vessels with their cargo of amphora, still arranged in careful rows. The Saint-Gervais wreck off France showed how ships were constructed in the 13th century, plank by plank, frame by frame, held together by wooden pegs and iron nails and the skill of craftsmen who never wrote down their methods but passed them hand to hand across generations. On land, scholars began looking at medieval sources with fresh eyes, cross-referencing archaeological evidence with written records that suddenly made more sense, that came alive with new understanding. Port records from Venice and Genoa, meticulously kept by officials obsessed with taxation and regulation, revealed patterns of trade, lists of cargo, names of merchants and ships, departure dates and arrival dates, losses and profits all recorded in careful script on parchment that survived when the ships themselves did not. Legal documents provided unexpected insights. Contracts between merchants specified exactly how cargo should be packed, how much water and food must be provided for crew and passengers, what insurance would be paid if the ship was lost to storm or piracy, who bore responsibility if goods arrived damaged by seawater or rats or simple rough handling. Maritime law codes, passed down and modified over centuries, codified the rules of life at sea, the division of salvage rights, the captain's authority, the compensation due if a sailor was injured or killed in the course of a voyage. Letters written by merchants to their partners provided human details that official documents never mentioned. They complained about dishonest captains who diverted ships to unauthorized ports to conduct private business, about storms that left them praying for death as the ship rolled and pitched and seemed certain to capsize, about the relief of sighting land after weeks at sea, about the quality of food aboard, the behaviour of fellow passengers, the thousand small irritations and dangers that came with maritime travel in an age when a journey from Barcelona to Tunis was an expedition into uncertainty. Church records added another dimension. Monasteries kept registers of pilgrims who passed through on their way to Jerusalem, noting which ships they sailed on, which captains they trusted, which routes were considered safest, which ports offered reliable supplies. Prayer books carried aboard ships, sometimes found in shipwrecks, showed the stains and wear of constant use, evidence of the deep faith that sustained people when human skill and effort weren't enough, when survival came down to divine mercy and the hope that God looked kindly on those who risked everything for profit or pilgrimage, or simply because the sea called to something in their souls. Artistic evidence emerged from unexpected sources. Marginal illustrations in medieval manuscripts showed ships in remarkable detail, drawn by scribes who had actually seen them, who knew how rigging was arranged, how cargo was loaded, how sailors climbed ratlines to adjust sails or scanned horizons for land or danger. Frescoes in coastal churches depicted miraculous rescues from shipwreck, showing accurately rendered vessels in distress, waves painted with the knowledge that came from watching the sea in all its moods, the artist capturing a moment of terror that resonated with anyone who had experienced storm at sea or knew someone who hadn't returned from a voyage. Harbour archaeology added yet more pieces to the puzzle. Excavations in ancient ports like Alexandria and Acre revealed the infrastructure that supported maritime trade, the massive stone quays where ships tied up, the warehouses where cargo was stored and sorted and repackaged, the customs houses where officials inspected goods and collected taxes, the shipyards where vessels were built and repaired, the smell of tar and sawdust, and the sound of hammers on wood filling the air from dawn to dusk. The picture that emerged from all this evidence from shipwrecks and documents and art and architecture was both grander and grimmer than the romantic legend suggested. These weren't adventure stories. though adventure certainly happened. They weren't tales of bold heroes conquering the sea, though courage was required in abundance. They were stories of ordinary people doing difficult, dangerous work because that's how the medieval economy functioned. How goods moved from where they were produced to where they were needed. How cultures connected across vast distances. How the foundations of our modern global trade networks were slowly, painfully, courageously laid by men and women who climbed aboard wooden ships and trusted their lives to wind and wave, and the skill of captains who navigated by stars and experience and prayers, whispered when no one else was listening. The more researchers discovered, the more they realized how little they actually knew, how much remained hidden in documents yet to be translated, shipwrecks yet to be found, details of daily life that left no physical trace but shaped the experience of everyone who ever watched land disappear behind them and faced weeks of uncertainty before another coast appeared ahead. If they were lucky, if the winds were fair, if God was merciful, if their ship proved sound and their captain capable, and their cargo didn't shift and their water didn't spoil and pirates didn't spot them, and storms didn't blow them off course into rocks or foreign harbours where strange customs and hostile officials waited. Each discovery opened new questions, revealed new mysteries, showed how much we still don't understand about the medieval maritime world and the extraordinary humans who inhabited it. When the first serious archaeological and historical evidence about medieval merchant ships began emerging in the latter half of the 20th century, the response from both scholars and the public was a mixture of fascination and disbelief, wonder at what was being revealed and skepticism that the picture being painted could possibly be accurate. The public, raised on romantic tales of adventure at sea, stories of Marco Polo and the Crusades, images of gallant knights and noble merchants braving the waves in service of faith and fortune, found it difficult to accept the grimmer reality the evidence revealed. These weren't comfortable journeys on elegant vessels crewed by colourful characters who burst into song while hauling ropes. These were desperate ventures on cramped, filthy, dangerous ships where seasickness was constant, where privacy didn't exist, where the smell of unwashed bodies and rotting food and bilge water created an atmosphere so foul that passengers often preferred to stay on deck in rain or burning sun rather than descend below where the air itself seemed poisonous. Early historians who specialised in maritime studies faced pushback from colleagues who thought the focus too narrow, too disconnected from the grand political and religious narratives that dominated medieval scholarship. Why spend years studying ship timbers and cargo manifests when you could be analysing the theology of Thomas Aquinas or the military campaigns of Richard the Lionheart? What could merchant ships possibly tell us about the medieval mind, the medieval soul, the great questions of faith and power that supposedly defined the era? But a dedicated group of researchers persisted, arguing that you couldn't understand the medieval Mediterranean world without understanding the ships that connected it, the trade that sustained it, the networks of commerce and communication that made possible everything from Crusader kingdoms to Renaissance banking. They insisted that the ordinary merchant sailor, the anonymous trader, the unnamed captain who successfully navigated from Marseille to Beirut and back again without incident or glory, these people were as important to history as any king or pope or general, that their collective achievement of maintaining trade networks across hostile waters and hostile cultures created the economic foundation that supported medieval civilization itself. As evidence accumulated, certain revelations proved particularly controversial. The diversity of crews, for instance, challenged comfortable assumptions about medieval religious segregation. Ships regularly carried mixed crews of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, working side by side because competence mattered more than faith, when your survival depended on every person doing their job correctly. Captains hired the best navigators available regardless of religion. Merchants formed partnerships across religious divides because profit had its own logic. Sailors shared quarters and food and danger with people their churches taught them to fear or despise, and somehow they made it work because the alternative was death. This religious pragmatism at sea contrasted sharply with the religious violence on land, the crusades and persecutions and forced conversions that mark medieval history, like bloodstains on old parchment. Scholars struggled to reconcile these two realities, to explain how the same era that produced pogroms and holy wars also produced maritime communities where a Christian captain might employ a Muslim navigator and a Jewish merchant, where men who would be enemies in port became something like brothers at sea, bound by shared danger and the knowledge that the Mediterranean cared nothing for theology, that waves drowned believers and infidels with equal indifference. The role of women aboard ship also sparked debate. Official records rarely mentioned women at sea, leading earlier historians to assume maritime commerce was an exclusively male domain. But closer examination revealed female merchants travelling with their goods, wives accompanying husbands on trading voyages, pilgrims journeying to holy sites, even occasional references to women working aboard ship in various capacities. They were minority participants certainly, but they were present, active, engaged in the maritime economy in ways that complicated the simple narrative of medieval ships, as floating men's clubs where women appeared only as cargo or captives, or the occasional saint statue bolted to the bow. Questions of navigation produced particularly heated arguments among scholars. How exactly did medieval sailors find their way across hundreds of miles of open water without reliable charts, without magnetic compasses in the early centuries, without any of the instruments and technologies we associate with accurate navigation? Some historians insisted it must have been largely guesswork, luck, prayers answered more often than probability suggested. Others pointed to evidence of sophisticated knowledge of stars and currents, of oral traditions passed from master to apprentice, of mental maps built over lifetimes of observation, of an accumulated wisdom that allowed experienced captains to read the sea, the sky, the behaviour of birds and fish and winds in ways we've lost. Ways that seemed almost magical, but were actually the result of generations of patient attention, trial and error. Lessons learned the hard way and remembered because forgetting meant death. The discovery that ships regularly operated year-round contradicted earlier assumptions that Mediterranean trade shut down in winter, when storms were most frequent and dangerous. While activity certainly decreased in the worst months, documents showed that ships continued sailing, that urgent cargoes or desperate circumstances or simple greed drove captains to risk winter voyages that killed substantial numbers of them. The pressure to maintain trade, to keep goods flowing, to meet contractual obligations or seize market opportunities, apparently outweighed the very real danger of winter storms that could blow up suddenly and sink ships that might have survived the same weather in summer, when timbers were dry and crews were rested rather than exhausted and cold and demoralized. Perhaps the most controversial revelation was the sheer casualty rate. Careful analysis of port records, insurance claims and shipping contracts suggested that perhaps 10 to 15% of all voyages ended in total loss of ship and cargo, with many more suffering partial loss through storm damage, piracy, or fire. This meant anyone who made their living at sea, either as crew or merchant, had perhaps a 1 in 7 chance of dying by drowning, of being enslaved by pirates, of starving when ships were blown off course and ran out of food, or burning when cooking fires escaped control and turned wooden vessels into floating pyres. These weren't acceptable risks by any modern standard, but they were accepted risks in the medieval world where alternatives were limited and potential rewards were enormous, and death from disease or violence or accident was common enough on land that the sea's dangers seemed only marginally worse. As historians grappled with these uncomfortable truths, as they tried to understand the mindset of people who would voluntarily board ships knowing the statistics, knowing the dangers, knowing that 1 voyage in 7 ended in disaster, a picture began emerging of a kind of courage we struggle to comprehend, a fatalism mixed with faith and hope and desperation and ambition that drove thousands of people to keep sailing despite everything, to keep trusting their lives to wood and wind and human skill in an endeavour that killed so many yet sustained the trade, that built cities and enriched cultures and connected civilizations that would otherwise have remained isolated, ignorant of each other, poorer in every sense for that ignorance. The evidence wouldn't be denied, no matter how uncomfortable it made modern observers, no matter how it complicated our understanding of the medieval world. The ships had existed, the voyages had happened, the dangers were real, the casualties were documented, and the people who lived through it, who survived and sailed again, who made careers and fortunes or died trying, they deserved to be remembered as they actually were. Not as romantic legends, but as humans who faced the Mediterranean in all its beauty and terror, and somehow, against odds that should have defeated them, built the networks that changed the world. The medieval imagination loved the sea, celebrated it in songs and stories and illuminated manuscripts where ships sailed calm azure waters toward golden cities on distant shores, where merchants returned laden with silks and spices, where adventure came without real danger, where the Mediterranean was a stage for heroic deeds and romantic journeys that always, always ended well. These legends persist even now, embedded in our cultural memory, shaping how we imagine medieval trade and the lives of those who conducted it. We picture Marco Polo setting sail from Venice with excitement in his heart, bound for the wonders of the East. We imagine crusader ships bearing knights in shining armour toward Jerusalem blessed by bishops favoured by God. We see merchant princes in fine clothes making deals in exotic ports, their ships symbols of wealth and power and the triumph of commerce over distance and difficulty. The reality was so different, it might as well have been a different world entirely. Start with the ships themselves. In legends, they're grand vessels with billowing sails and proud figureheads, cutting cleanly through willing waves toward certain destinations. In reality, most medieval merchant ships were stubby, wide-beamed, ungainly craft that wallowed more than sailed, that made perhaps 4 or 5 knots in good conditions, that handled like pregnant cows and responded to steering so slowly that captains had to anticipate every change of direction well in advance. They weren't beautiful by any aesthetic standard we'd recognise. They were functional, built for cargo capacity rather than speed or elegance, their hulls stained with tar and salt and the general grime of hard use, their sails patched and repatched until more patch than original canvas remained, their decks cluttered with coiled rope and spare timber, and the various equipment necessary to keep a wooden ship functioning in an environment that constantly tried to destroy it. The legends speak of brave sailors manning these vessels, hardy men who loved the sea and found freedom on its waters. The reality was that most sailors were desperately poor men with limited options, illiterate labourers who worked aboard ship because they couldn't find better employment on land, who endured conditions that would qualify as torture by modern standards, who were paid irregularly if at all, who were beaten by officers for infractions real or imagined, who suffered from malnutrition and scurvy, and the various diseases that flourished in the cramped, filthy conditions below deck. They didn't love the sea, they feared and hated it, and they worked aboard ship because the alternative was starvation, because a slim chance of survival at sea beat the certainty of death from hunger on land. Even the merchants, supposedly the romantic adventurers of medieval commerce, lived lives that bore little resemblance to the legends. Most never actually sailed with their goods. They hired agents, sent representatives, did business through intermediaries, and never set foot aboard ship if they could avoid it. Those who did travel by sea weren't seeking adventure, they were protecting investments too valuable to trust to others, and they spent most voyages seasick and miserable, huddled in whatever shelter they could find, praying for land and swearing never to sail again if God would just let them survive this one journey. The legends promise exotic ports filled with wonders, markets overflowing with rare goods, friendly encounters with fascinating cultures. Reality delivered dangerous harbours controlled by officials who viewed foreign merchants as sources of revenue to be squeezed dry, who imposed arbitrary taxes and fees, who confiscated cargo on dubious legal pretexts, who might imprison merchants for weeks or months while haggling over permits and payments. Language barriers made every transaction difficult. Cultural misunderstandings led to conflicts that could turn violent. Religious tensions simmered constantly beneath surface courtesy, and the simple logistics of verifying quality, negotiating price, arranging payment, and ensuring goods were actually loaded aboard the right ship created endless opportunities for confusion, deception, and loss. The romance of discovery, of being first to bring new goods to eager markets, collides with the reality of established trade routes and entrenched competition. Merchants didn't explore unknown waters seeking novelty. They followed routes used for centuries, stopping at the same ports their fathers and grandfathers had used, dealing with the same merchant families, trading the same goods in patterns so established that innovation was difficult and dangerous. The markets they served were conservative, suspicious of new products, resistant to change, and breaking into an established trade required connections, capital, and patience that most merchants lacked. Get-rich-quick schemes usually just got you bankrupt quick, leaving you stranded in a foreign port with debts you couldn't pay and a ship you couldn't afford to sail home. Even the supposedly glamorous cargoes turn out to be less romantic under examination. Yes, ships carried silk and spices and precious gems, but they also carried much more mundane goods that formed the real backbone of Mediterranean trade. Grain from Egypt and North Africa fed Italian cities that couldn't grow enough to sustain their populations. Salt fish from the Atlantic coast provided protein for inland communities. Timber from the Balkans built ships and houses across the treeless Mediterranean islands. Iron and copper and tin moved from mines to smithies. Wool and cotton and linen travelled from weavers to dyers to tailors in complex networks of production and exchange. Olive oil and wine and cheese and dried fruits filled the holds of countless vessels, whose cargoes would never inspire songs or stories, but whose arrival meant the difference between eating and starving for thousands of ordinary people. The legends celebrate safe arrivals, profitable voyages, triumphant returns. They conveniently forget the ships that never returned. The merchants who invested everything in a single cargo that went down in a storm or was seized by pirates or rotted in the hold when contrary winds turned a 6-week voyage into 6 months of desperate rationing and slow starvation. For every merchant who grew wealthy from trade, 10 more struggled to break even, fought constantly against losses and delays and the 1,000 ways the sea could destroy everything you'd worked for, everything you'd risked, everything you'd hoped would secure your family's future. Perhaps the cruelest contradiction between legend and reality involves the supposed freedom of life at sea. Stories portray sailors escaping the rigid hierarchies of medieval society, finding equality and brotherhood in shared danger. But ships were in many ways more hierarchical and oppressive than life on land. The captain was absolute master whose word was law, who could order floggings or worse with no appeal, who controlled food and water distribution, who made decisions about routes and risks that affected everyone but consulted no one. Officers formed a separate class with better food, better quarters, better pay, and absolute authority over common sailors who existed in a state of semi-slavery, bound by contracts they couldn't read to terms they didn't understand, trapped for the duration of the voyage with no escape, no recourse, no protection beyond the captain's whim, and whatever sense of obligation he might feel toward the human cargo in his charge. The sea itself, painted in legends as a romantic blue highway connecting cultures, was in reality a killing field that took lives with casual indifference. Sailors who fell overboard were rarely rescued. You simply couldn't stop and turn around quickly enough to find someone in the waves, so the unofficial rule was that anyone who went over was dead. You said a prayer and moved on because dwelling on it would drive you mad. Disease spread rapidly in close quarters, killing crews faster than any storm. Fire was a constant terror on wooden ships where cooking required open flame, and cargo often included flammable materials and tar-sealed every seam. Collisions happened in fog or darkness, ships running into each other or into rocks or simply into debris floating unseen beneath the surface, punching holes in hulls that could sink a vessel in minutes. The gap between legend and reality wasn't just wide, it was a chasm, an unbridgeable distance between the stories people wanted to believe and the truth of what actually happened on medieval merchant ships crossing the Mediterranean's often hostile waters. Understanding that gap, sitting with the discomfort it creates, is essential to understanding the real courage of the people who sailed despite knowing the truth, who faced the reality rather than the legend and decided the potential rewards, the necessity of commerce, the simple need to survive justified the terrible risks they accepted every time they cast off from a safe harbour and pointed their bows toward the horizon and whatever fate waited beyond it. The more evidence accumulated about life aboard medieval merchant ships, the more historians found themselves divided over fundamental questions about how these vessels actually operated, who controlled them, how crews were organised, and what motivated people to keep sailing despite the documented dangers. The first major debate centred on ship ownership and control. One school of thought argued that medieval merchant ships operated under a kind of collective ownership, with multiple investors sharing both costs and profits, spreading risk across several parties so no single person would be ruined if the ship was lost. This theory drew support from surviving contracts that showed elaborate arrangements, where one party owned the hull, another the cargo, a third provided capital for supplies, with profits divided according to complex formulas that seemed to change with every document. These historians saw medieval maritime trade as fundamentally collaborative, a web of partnerships and shared ventures that allowed even modest merchants to participate in long-distance commerce. The opposing view insisted this overstated cooperation and understated competition. These scholars pointed to evidence of powerful merchant families who dominated particular routes, who owned ships outright, who used their capital and connections to squeeze out smaller competitors, who operated more like medieval monopolies than cooperative ventures. They noted cases of merchants deliberately spreading false information about market conditions to gain advantage, of captains being bribed to deliver rivals' goods late or damaged, of systematic efforts to control access to certain ports or certain cargoes. In this interpretation, medieval maritime trade was cutthroat capitalism in its rawest form, limited only by the technology available and the legal frameworks that were still developing. The truth, as several historians eventually argued, probably lay somewhere between these extremes, shifting based on time period, region, and individual circumstances. A small merchant from Pisa might need partners to afford a voyage to Alexandria, while a wealthy Venetian family could finance entire fleets independently. The system was flexible enough to accommodate both models, pragmatic enough to adopt whatever structure worked for the specific situation. Questions of crew hierarchy generated equally passionate disagreement. Traditional maritime historians, drawing on later nautical traditions, assumed medieval ships operated under strict military-style discipline with clearly defined ranks, explicit chains of command, and formal protocols governing every aspect of shipboard life. They pointed to maritime law codes that specified punishments for various offences, contracts that listed different pay rates for different positions, and the logical necessity of clear authority when lives depended on split-second decisions in emergencies. Revisionist scholars challenged this tidy picture, arguing it projected later naval organisation backward onto an era when merchant ships were smaller, crews were less specialised, and the boundary between sailor and merchant, between officer and common hand, was much more fluid than later centuries would allow. They found evidence of crews making collective decisions about routes and risks, of profit-sharing arrangements that gave even ordinary sailors stake in successful voyages, of captains who were chosen by crews rather than imposed by owners, of a more democratic or at least less rigidly hierarchical shipboard culture than traditional accounts suggested. Documents support both interpretations depending on which you emphasize. A contract from Genoa in 1278 specifies exact duties and pay for positions from captain down to cabin boy, suggesting formal hierarchy. But a letter from Barcelona in 1291 describes a crew voting on whether to continue to their original destination or divert to a closer port when supplies ran low, suggesting collective decision-making. Perhaps both systems coexisted, perhaps practice varied by region and captain and circumstances. Perhaps the formal hierarchy existed on parchment, while actual operations were more flexible and negotiated. Navigation methods sparked particularly intense debate because the stakes were high, the evidence was fragmentary, and modern scholars struggled to understand how medieval sailors could possibly have succeeded using techniques that seemed impossibly primitive. One faction insisted that Mediterranean navigation was primarily coastal, that ships stayed within sight of land whenever possible, that captains had memorized the appearance of every headland and harbour along their routes, that open water passages were kept as short as possible and undertaken only when absolutely necessary. This theory had the advantage of requiring no special instruments or knowledge beyond careful observation and good memory. But critics pointed out that coastal sailing added enormous time and distance to many routes, that hugging shorelines exposed ships to greater danger from rocks and sudden offshore storms, that numerous documents described ships making direct passages across open water, taking routes that kept them out of sight of land for days. These historians argued for more sophisticated navigation based on celestial observation, dead reckoning, knowledge of prevailing winds and currents, perhaps even early versions of charts and compasses that left a little physical evidence, but were mentioned occasionally in texts. They suggested medieval navigators possessed systematic knowledge that their culture didn't write down, that was passed orally from master to apprentice, that was considered too valuable or too difficult to explain in writing. A third group proposed that both methods were used simultaneously, that ships stayed coastal when practical but crossed open water when necessary, that captains used every available technique, visual landmarks and stars and currents, and bird behaviour and cloud patterns, and the colour and taste of water, and the thousand subtle signs that experienced mariners learned to read even if they couldn't articulate exactly what they knew or how they knew it. This integrated approach had the advantage of matching the complexity of the evidence, though it left unresolved the question of exactly what techniques were used, when, and how reliable they actually were. The role of religion aboard ship generated disagreement that went beyond historical interpretation into questions of how medieval people actually thought and felt about their faith. Some historians emphasize the intense religiosity evident in sources, the constant prayers and vows and rituals that marked shipboard life, the shrines maintained aboard vessels, the offerings made before departure and after safe arrival, the conviction that divine intervention determined outcomes more than human skill or planning. In this view, medieval sailors saw themselves as essentially helpless before forces beyond their control, their primary agency lying in prayer and proper observance of religious duties that might incline God toward mercy. Other scholars found this interpretation patronizing and historically naive, arguing it reduced medieval people to superstitious primitives who couldn't distinguish between religious comfort and practical seamanship. They pointed to evidence of careful planning, systematic preparation, rational decision-making about routes and timing and risk assessment. Yes, sailors prayed, but they also maintained their ships, studied weather patterns, learned from experience, made calculated choices based on available information. Their religion didn't replace practical knowledge, it supplemented it, provided psychological comfort and social cohesion, and explanatory frameworks for events they couldn't fully control or predict. The question of how crews from different religious and ethnic backgrounds actually coexisted aboard ship produced theories ranging from harmonious cooperation to barely controlled hostility. Some historians emphasized evidence of shared meals, joint labor, mutual respect born from shared danger. Others pointed to documented conflicts, fights over food or sleeping space or religious observances, tensions that sometimes erupted into violence that captains struggled to control. The reality probably included both cooperation and conflict, solidarity and suspicion, pragmatic tolerance overlying deeper prejudices that surfaced under stress or when circumstances made different groups compete rather than collaborate. Perhaps the most fundamental debate involved the question of why people kept sailing despite everything. What mixture of necessity and greed and hope and desperation and ambition drove them to accept risks that killed so many? Economic determinists argued it was simply rational calculation. The potential rewards outweighed the risks for people with limited alternatives, especially in a world where death was common from many causes and the sea was just one more danger among many. Cultural historians emphasized the attraction of travel itself, the desire to see distant places, the status that came from being a man who had been places and done things most people only heard about in stories. Some proposed that people simply didn't understand the risks, that they lacked statistical thinking, that each captain thought he was skilled enough to avoid the fate that befell others, that human optimism and inability to truly grasp probability led people to underestimate dangers that should have been obvious. Others argued the opposite, that medieval people understood risk perfectly well, perhaps better than we do because death was more present in their lives, because they'd watched plague and war and famine take people they loved, because they knew in their bones that life was uncertain, and you might as well take chances that offered reward rather than accept guaranteed poverty and slow starvation on land. These debates continue because the evidence doesn't definitively settle them, because medieval people didn't explain their choices in ways that satisfy modern scholars seeking clear answers to complex questions. What remains certain is that they sailed, they died in substantial numbers, and those who survived sailed again, creating the networks and knowledge that made Mediterranean trade increasingly reliable and profitable, even as it remained profoundly dangerous, even as every voyage remained an act of courage and calculation and faith in proportions we'll never fully understand. Understanding what life was actually like aboard a medieval merchant ship required researchers to become detectives, piecing together evidence from dozens of sources, cross-referencing archaeological finds with written documents, comparing different types of ships and different time periods, slowly building a composite picture that could never be complete, but could at least approach the truth. The physical investigation started with the wrecks themselves, those precious few vessels that sank in conditions that preserved them, that went down in locations where modern technology could reach them, that weren't looted or destroyed by bottom trawlers, or simply scattered by centuries of currents into unrecognizable debris fields. Each wreck excavation was a massive undertaking requiring specialized equipment, trained divers, careful mapping and recording, conservation expertise to prevent artifacts from disintegrating the moment they left the water that had preserved them. Archaeologists working on the Sertolemena wreck spent years underwater, carefully removing cargo and equipment, photographing everything in place before disturbing it, creating detailed site maps that showed how the ship was loaded, where different types of cargo were stowed, what equipment was kept where for easy access. They discovered that glass cargo, despite being fragile, was packed in the centre of the hold surrounded by amphoras of wine that provided cushioning, that heavier items like iron ingots were placed low in the hull to maintain stability, that the ship carried far more water storage capacity than expected, suggesting crews anticipated longer voyages or more time in ports without reliable fresh water than documents indicated. The timber itself told stories. Growth rings revealed where trees were harvested, what climate conditions existed when they grew, allowing researchers to date construction and understand something about timber sources and trade networks that supplied shipyards. Tool marks showed construction techniques, how planks were shaped and fitted, what kinds of saws and adzes and drills were available to medieval shipwrights. Repair evidence revealed which parts of ships took the most stress, where planks cracked or came loose, how crews made emergency repairs at sea when reaching a shipyard wasn't possible. But shipwrecks only showed ships that failed, vessels that sank rather than completed their voyages. To understand successful operations, researchers had to turn to documentary evidence, and that's where the real detective work began, because medieval documents weren't written for historians. They were written for immediate practical purposes by people who assumed certain knowledge, who didn't explain what everyone already knew, who used technical terminology and local slang that made perfect sense to contemporary readers, but leaves modern scholars puzzling over meanings. Port records from major trading cities proved invaluable despite their limitations. Venetian customs officials recorded every ship that entered the harbour, noting name, captain, home port, cargo, tonnage, dates of arrival and departure. These records, preserved in vast archives, allowed researchers to track individual ships across multiple voyages, to see how long they stayed in port, what they carried outbound versus inbound, how seasonal patterns affected traffic. Similar records from Genoa, Barcelona, Marseille, and other major ports created a network of data points that could be connected and analysed. But the records had frustrating gaps. Smaller ports kept less systematic records or none at all. Pirates certainly kept no official logs of their activities. Ships that sank left no arrival records. Smuggling, widespread and profitable, doesn't appear in customs documents by definition. The official picture was incomplete, biased toward legal trade through major ports, missing perhaps half of actual maritime activity. Legal documents provided different insights. Contracts between merchants specified exactly what was being shipped, who owned it, who bore risks at different stages of the voyage, what insurance covered, what circumstances, what penalties applied if agreements weren't fulfilled. Reading hundreds of these contracts revealed standard practices, common clauses, the evolution of maritime law as merchants and lawyers tried to anticipate and address every possible complication, every scenario where something could go wrong and parties might dispute responsibility. Insurance records were particularly revealing, because insurers needed accurate information about risks to price policies correctly. They kept detailed records of losses, noting which routes were most dangerous, which seasons saw most disasters, which types of cargo were most likely to be damaged, which captains had better or worse track records. These records, written for business purposes with no romantic illusions, provided hard data about the real dangers of medieval maritime trade. Letters between merchants added human details that official records never captured. A merchant in Acre, writing to his partner in Venice, complained that the captain they'd hired was drunk more often than sober, that the ship leaked badly, that rats had gotten into the grain cargo despite precautions, that he feared arriving with damaged goods that wouldn't command expected prices. Another letter described a storm that tore sails and washed 2 crewmen overboard, the captain's decision to shelter in an unplanned port, where local officials extorted outrageous fees, the fear that delays would cause them to miss market windows that made the whole voyage pointless. Literary sources, though requiring careful interpretation, added atmospheric details. Pilgrims writing about journeys to Jerusalem described shipboard life with the observational detail of outsiders who found everything noteworthy. They complained about seasickness, about the food, about the lack of privacy, about the rough behaviour of sailors, about the terror of storms and the relief of reaching land. Their accounts, meant to edify readers rather than document maritime practices, nonetheless captured the experience of being aboard ship in ways official documents never attempted. Medical texts provided unexpected insights. Ship surgeons, those who existed, kept notes about injuries and illnesses treated aboard ship. They described the kinds of accidents that happened during normal operations: crushed fingers and broken bones from handling cargo, rope burns, falls from rigging, hernias from lifting heavy items, infections from wounds that went untreated too long, the progressive symptoms of scurvy on extended voyages, dehydration from drinking contaminated water, food poisoning from spoiled provisions. These clinical descriptions revealed the physical toll that shipboard life extracted from everyone who experienced it. Archaeological investigation of ports themselves revealed infrastructure that documents only mentioned in passing. Excavations showed how quays were constructed to handle the weight of cargo and equipment, how warehouses were designed to store different types of goods, how shipyards were organized to allow multiple vessels to be worked on simultaneously. The physical layout of port facilities revealed priorities and practices that written sources took for granted and therefore never explained. Experimental archaeology added another dimension to investigation. Researchers built reconstructions of medieval ships using period-appropriate techniques and materials, then sailed them to test performance and handling. These experiments reveal that ships were slower than documents sometimes suggested, that they couldn't sail as close to the wind as later vessels, that they required larger crews for certain operations, that loading and unloading took far longer than modern standards because everything had to be moved by human muscle power, with only simple tools and basic rigging. Ethnographic comparison with traditional maritime cultures that survived into modern times provided insights into practices that might have parallels in the medieval Mediterranean. Researchers studied how Arab dhow captains navigate using traditional methods, how Polynesian navigators read currents and stars, how Indonesian shipwrights build vessels without written plans, looking for techniques that might shed light on medieval practices that left little direct evidence. Each investigation method had limitations, biases, gaps, but by combining them, cross-referencing findings, checking one source against another, being willing to revise theories when new evidence emerged, researchers slowly constructed a picture of medieval maritime life that was more complex, more nuanced, more human than earlier scholarship suggested. The investigation continues. New wrecks are discovered, new documents are translated, new analytical techniques reveal information that earlier researchers missed, and the picture keeps coming into sharper focus even as it reveals how much we still don't know. How much remains buried in the depths, or lost in archives, or simply vanished beyond any hope of recovery. The physical evidence salvaged from shipwrecks and preserved in port archives created a mosaic of medieval maritime life, each piece small and fragmentary, but together forming a picture of extraordinary detail, a window into a world we can almost touch across the centuries. Start with the ship itself, the wooden shell that contained everything. Analysis of surviving timbers revealed construction techniques that relied on the eye and hand more than measurement or calculation. Planks were shaped to fit by eye, tested, shaved down, tested again until they matched perfectly. Frame pieces were cut from naturally curved timber, shipwrights selecting trees that had grown in shapes useful for knees and ribs, working with the wood's natural form rather than forcing it into unnatural configurations. The result was vessels that seemed almost organic, grown rather than built, each one slightly different even when constructed in the same yard by the same craftsman. Iron fastenings, mostly nails in various sizes, showed how the ship was held together. Chemical analysis of corrosion products revealed that many nails were made from bog iron, a lower quality material that was cheaper and more available than properly smelted iron. This explained why ships needed constant maintenance, why seams worked loose and planks separated, why captains carried spare nails and sailcloth and rope, and all the materials needed for repairs, because the ship itself was slowly deteriorating from the moment it launched. In a race between maintenance and decay that the ship would eventually lose but that could be postponed through constant vigilant work. Rope fragments preserved in shipwreck showed remarkable variety. Heavy anchor ropes thick as a man's arm, made from multiple strands twisted together with a tightness that took specialized tools and considerable strength to achieve. Lighter running rigging that controlled sails, replaced frequently because constant motion through pulleys wore them down faster than any other component. Lashing used to secure cargo, sometimes showing knots still tied exactly as they were 8 centuries ago. The last act of a sailor who never imagined anyone would see his work again, would study how he tied off a barrel or secured a crate, would note his technique and skill and the evidence that he knew his craft even if we'll never know his name. Sails rarely survived, canvas being too organic to last, but occasional fragments showed they were made from linen or wool, woven into heavy fabric that could withstand wind stress, often patched extensively. Some patches on patches on patches until determining what was original and what was repair became impossible. Dye residues suggested many sails were coloured, reds and ochres and browns, practical colours that wouldn't show dirt as quickly as undyed canvas, but also marking ships as belonging to particular owners or trading out of particular ports, visual identification from distances too great to see painted names or carved figureheads. The cargo itself provided the richest evidence of what ships carried and how trade actually functioned. Amphoras for wine and oil showed standardized sizes and shapes that indicated sophisticated production systems, potters in one region making vessels to specifications that merchants in distant ports would recognize and accept, an early form of product standardization that facilitated trade across language and cultural barriers. The amphoras themselves often bore marks, stamps, or painted letters that identified contents, origin, vintage, intended recipient, creating a paper trail in clay that customs officials could verify and merchants could use to track shipments. Glass cargo from the Circe Limina wreck revealed the recycling economy that underpinned medieval industry. 3 tons of broken glass. Cullet destined for glassmakers who would melt it down and form it into new vessels, transported because raw materials for glass production were expensive and limited, while broken glass was cheap and abundant in cities where glass vessels were common. Alongside the cullet were finished glass pieces, bowls and cups and bottles of remarkable beauty and delicacy, luxury goods that commanded high prices, the profitable cargo that justified transporting the low-value cullet that filled unused space and added ballast. Coins found in wrecks told multiple stories. The mixture of currencies from different kingdoms and cities reflected the complexity of Mediterranean trade, the need for merchants to handle money from dozens of different mints, to know current exchange rates, to verify authenticity of unfamiliar coinage. The presence of gold coins, relatively rare, suggested either wealthy passengers or high-value transactions. Silver and bronze coins, more common, represented everyday commerce. Some coins showed signs of clipping, edges deliberately shaved to steal precious metal, evidence of the petty fraud that plagued medieval economies and why merchants preferred to weigh coins rather than count them, trusting weight more than official denomination. Weapons aboard merchant ships range from simple knives and clubs to swords, and even a suit of armour on one wreck, evidence that ships went armed, that crews expected to defend themselves, or that passengers included soldiers travelling to or from military service. The wear patterns on weapon handles, the repairs and maintenance evident even on corroded blades, showed these weren't decorative items but tools kept ready for use. Insurance against pirates or hostile encounters that everyone hoped to avoid but prepared for nonetheless. Personal possessions provided the most intimate connection to the people aboard. Gaming pieces carved from bone, used to pass long hours at sea playing games whose rules we can only guess at. Combs and razors suggesting attention to grooming, even in the harsh shipboard environment. Religious medallions and crosses and crescents showing the diversity of faiths aboard ship, each person carrying their own protection, their own hope that divine favour might preserve them when human skill wasn't enough. A wooden writing tablet with wax surface still showing faint marks, someone's calculations or letter half written and never finished, abandoned when the ship went down and preserved accidentally. A voice across centuries speaking words we can barely read. Fishing equipment aboard ships revealed a practice documents rarely mentioned, that crews supplemented provisions by fishing, that the sea provided food as well as transportation. Hooks and sinkers and lead weights for nets showed this wasn't occasional sport but systematic exploitation of the resource literally beneath the hull, a way to stretch supplies when voyages ran longer than planned, when rations needed to be extended, when fresh food became a distant memory, and even badly cooked fish seemed like a feast. Cooking equipment revealed the challenge of preparing food aboard a moving platform surrounded by flammable materials. Ceramic braziers, small and carefully designed to contain fire, often showing burn marks and soot accumulation from constant use. Copper pots, expensive but durable, sometimes repaired with patches that showed they were valued and maintained rather than casually replaced. Stone grinding tools for processing grain into edible form, evidence that bread was baked aboard despite the difficulty and danger of maintaining fire needed for baking. Water storage systems showed the desperate importance of fresh water on voyages where running out meant slow death by dehydration. Large ceramic jars for bulk storage, positioned low in the hold where their weight helped stability. Smaller containers for daily use, kept accessible on deck where crews needed frequent drinking water during hot Mediterranean summers. Residue analysis showed that water quality degraded quickly, that ships leaving port with fresh water arrived weeks later with something barely drinkable. Green with algae and foul-tasting but still life-sustaining if you had no alternative. Navigation tools were surprisingly simple by modern standards. A lead line for sounding depth in coastal waters, with hollow bottom that could be filled with tallow to collect samples of the sea floor, experienced captains reading meaning in mud or sand or shell fragments brought up from below. Fragments of what might have been early compasses, though the evidence was ambiguous and debated. No charts survived from wrecks, perhaps because they were rare and valuable enough to be kept in captains' quarters where organic materials decayed completely, perhaps because they didn't exist, and navigation was purely mental, carried in experienced heads that sank with the ship. Repair materials carried aboard showed that crews expected damage and prepared to address it. Spare planks cut to approximate sizes, ready to patch holes, lead sheeting that could be nailed over leaks, oakum for recalking seams that worked loose, tar for waterproofing, tools for carpentry and basic metalwork. Everything needed to keep a damaged ship afloat long enough to reach port, not to repair it properly, but to jury-rig enough temporary fixes that you had a fighting chance of making land before the sea claimed what you were desperately trying to save. Each artifact, each fragment, each piece of preserved evidence added another detail to our understanding, another glimpse into the reality of medieval maritime life. Separately, they were just objects, corroded and broken and mysterious. Together, they told a story of human persistence, of people who built ships that barely worked by modern standards and sailed them anyway, who faced dangers that would make us refuse to board and did it repeatedly, who created the trade networks that connected the medieval Mediterranean world through sheer stubborn determination to keep trying despite everything, to keep loading cargo and casting off and pointing toward distant horizons and hoping that this time, this voyage, they'd be among the lucky ones who returned. Beneath the surface details of ship construction and cargo manifests and navigational techniques, the evidence revealed something historians hadn't fully anticipated. A truth about medieval merchant ships that complicated every simple narrative about medieval society and forced a fundamental reconsideration of how different cultures actually interacted in the 13th century Mediterranean. The ships themselves were cultural crossroads, floating spaces where the rigid religious and ethnic divisions that defined medieval land-based societies dissolved into something far more fluid and pragmatic, where necessity created communities that shouldn't have existed according to the official ideologies of the era. This wasn't immediately obvious from the documents, which used formulaic language and rarely mentioned crew composition in detail, but careful analysis revealed patterns that became impossible to ignore. A Venetian merchant ship departing for Alexandria carried a Genoese navigator, because he knew those waters better than any Venetian available. A Catalan vessel employed a Muslim pilot to guide them through the treacherous approaches to North African ports where he had family connections that smoothed negotiations with local authorities. A Byzantine ship sailed with a mixed crew of Greeks, Italians and Levantine Arabs because the captain hired whoever showed up at the dock with necessary skills and willingness to work for the wages offered. Insurance records inadvertently documented this diversity. When ships were lost, insurers had to verify who was aboard to determine what claims were legitimate. The resulting list showed crews that would have been scandalous on land, impossible in most medieval contexts, yet apparently normal and unremarkable at sea. Christians, Muslims, and Jews working side by side, eating from common pots, sleeping in the same cramped quarters, sharing the intimate dangers and discomforts of maritime life in ways that erased or at least suspended the hostilities that defined interactions between these groups in ports and cities and kingdoms. The deeper mystery wasn't just that this happened, but why it worked. What allowed people who were supposed to be enemies to function as crews, to trust each other with their lives, to develop the working relationships essential for survival aboard ship? Part of the answer was necessity. The simple fact that ships required specific skills and knowledge that couldn't be filtered by religious or ethnic preference without making voyages impossible. A good navigator was a good navigator regardless of what god he prayed to, and a captain who insisted on doctrinal purity over competence would likely end up lost or dead or both. But necessity alone doesn't explain the evidence of genuine cooperation, even friendship that occasionally appears in sources. Letters mention celebrations aboard ship that included the entire crew, regardless of background, shared meals during religious festivals that each culture observed in their own way, while making space for others' practices. A Genoese merchant writing home described attending the funeral at sea of a Muslim crew member, the Christian sailors showing respect for Islamic burial rites even though they didn't share the faith, the recognition that this man had been their brother in the way that mattered aboard ship, even if he would have been an enemy, or at best a stranger in any other context. Ship surgeons' notes revealed another dimension of this mystery. Medical treatment aboard ship was apparently provided to anyone who needed it, regardless of religious or ethnic identity, the surgeon making no distinction between Christian and Muslim and Jewish patients, because a sick crew member was a liability to everyone, because compassion or at least pragmatic self-interest dictated treating whoever needed help. Some medical texts even suggested that different cultural traditions shared remedies and techniques, that knowledge crossed religious boundaries, that healers learned from each other in ways that enriched everyone's practice. The religious artifacts found aboard wrecks told complex stories. Christian shrines with carved saints coexisted with Islamic prayer rugs, Jewish mezuzahs alongside Orthodox icons, suggesting ships accommodated multiple faith traditions simultaneously, rather than imposing single religious identity. How this worked practically, how crews negotiated prayer times and dietary restrictions, and the dozens of ways religious practice could create conflict in close quarters, the sources mostly don't explain because it was apparently so normal, so unremarkable that no one thought to describe it. Language aboard ship must have been equally complex. Crews from different linguistic backgrounds needed to communicate about technical matters where miscommunication could be fatal. Evidence suggests the development of a kind of maritime lingua franca, a simplified common language that borrowed from multiple sources, that focused on the specific vocabulary needed for shipboard operations, that allowed a Greek captain to give orders a Catalan sailor and an Arab navigator could both understand even if none of them could have held a sophisticated conversation in each other's native tongues. This linguistic flexibility extended beyond basic commands. Merchants operating across the Mediterranean had to negotiate in multiple languages, had to understand not just words but cultural contexts, the different business practices and expectations that varied from port to port. The successful merchants, those whose careers spanned decades and multiple voyages, often became functionally multilingual, equally comfortable haggling in Italian markets and North African souks, able to shift between cultural contexts as easily as changing clothes, their identities fluid in ways that land-based medieval people would have found bewildering or threatening. The deeper you investigate, the more evidence accumulates that merchant ships functioned as alternative societies, spaces where different rules applied, where the normal boundaries and hierarchies and hostilities of medieval life were suspended in favour of whatever social organisation allowed the ship to function, the voyage to succeed, everyone aboard to survive. This wasn't idealism or progressive politics. It was raw pragmatism born from the understanding that the sea was enemy enough without adding unnecessary human conflicts to the danger. But this pragmatic tolerance aboard ship makes the behaviour of these same people on land even more puzzling and disturbing. Sailors who worked peacefully with Muslims at sea might participate in persecution of Muslim communities in their home ports. Merchants who formed partnerships across religious lines during voyages maintained strict social segregation in their home cities. The ability to turn tolerance on and off depending on context to treat the same people as brothers at sea and enemies on land reveals something unsettling about human nature, about how situational our loyalties and prejudices can be, how much our behaviour depends on immediate circumstances rather than deep convictions. Perhaps the greatest mystery is why this aspect of medieval maritime life was so rarely discussed in contemporary sources. Why chronicles and histories and even personal letters mostly ignored the multicultural reality of ship crews and trading networks. Was it so common that it seemed unremarkable, not worth mentioning? Was it quietly shameful, something people participated in but didn't advertise because it contradicted official ideologies? Was it simply invisible to the chroniclers and historians who wrote from land-based perspectives and didn't think maritime life worthy of detailed description? Whatever the explanation, the evidence is clear that medieval merchant ships created temporary communities that crossed every major boundary of their era, that they functioned as laboratories of coexistence that produced working models of interfaith and intercultural cooperation that their own societies mostly couldn't or wouldn't replicate on land. The ships were microcosms of a Mediterranean world that could have been, perhaps should have been, but mostly wasn't except in those narrow wooden spaces where survival demanded something better than the hatreds and divisions that characterize so much of medieval history. Understanding this changes how we think about the medieval Mediterranean, reveals possibilities that existed alongside the Crusades and persecutions, shows that people of that era were capable of crossing cultural boundaries when circumstances made it necessary or beneficial, that the rigid divisions we associate with the medieval world were always more permeable and negotiable than traditional history suggested. The ships and the people who sailed them proved it was possible, even if the larger societies they sailed from and to mostly failed to learn or apply the lessons that every successful voyage taught. The voyage that changed everything departed Genoa on the 15th of March in the year 1298, an ordinary merchant vessel on what seemed a routine trading run to Alexandria with a cargo of wool and iron, expecting to return in 3 months with Egyptian cotton and Syrian glass. Profit margins calculated, risks assessed, everything planned according to patterns established over decades of similar voyages. The ship was called Santa Lucia, a common enough name, captained by a man named Matteo di Savona, who had made this run 17 times before without serious incident, who knew the route and the ports and the officials who had to be bribed and the merchants who could be trusted. The crew was typical for the era, 16 men of mixed backgrounds, half Italian, the rest a mixture of Greeks, Catalans, and one Arab navigator who knew the North African coast better than any Christian pilot available for hire. Nothing in the departure suggested this voyage would be different from any other. The weather was fair, the ship properly provisioned, the cargo carefully stowed, the crew experienced. They cleared the harbour without incident, caught favourable winds, made good progress south along the Italian coast, then east towards Sicily, following the standard route that kept them close enough to land for safety while maintaining enough distance to avoid coastal dangers. But on the 8th day out, everything changed in a way no one could have predicted or prepared for, in a moment that revealed truths about medieval maritime life that would reshape how everyone understood the entire enterprise of Mediterranean trade. They were approaching the Strait of Messina when the lookout spotted another vessel ahead, moving slowly, apparently damaged, sails hanging loose, clearly in distress. The normal response would be to investigate. Maritime law and simple humanity both demanded offering assistance to vessels in trouble, though captains also had to weigh the risk that distress signals might be pirate tricks designed to lure good Samaritans into ambush. Matteo approached cautiously, close enough to hail the other ship, far enough to run if it proved to be a trap. What he found was a Byzantine merchant vessel that had been attacked by pirates 2 days earlier, half the crew killed or taken captive. The ship looted of anything valuable, left drifting with just enough survivors to possibly make port if luck and God's mercy both favoured them. This was the moment of decision, the turning point where everything could have continued according to normal patterns, or changed into something unprecedented. Matteo could have offered minimal assistance, shared some food and water, perhaps towed them to the nearest port if it wasn't too far out of his way, fulfilled his legal and moral obligations without significantly disrupting his own voyage and profit calculations. That's what most captains would have done, what prudence and business sense both recommended. But Matteo made a different choice, one that his merchant employers would condemn, that maritime law didn't require, that seemed to make no economic sense whatsoever. He took the Byzantine survivors aboard Santa Lucia, not just feeding them, but offering them places in his crew, sharing his provisions that were calculated for specific numbers across a specific voyage duration, accepting the burden and risk and cost of these additional souls when he had no obligation to do more than ensure they didn't die immediately. More than that, he changed his entire voyage plan. Instead of continuing to Alexandria as contracted, as his cargo manifest required, as his investors expected, he diverted to Constantinople to deliver the Byzantine survivors home, adding weeks to the voyage, using supplies meant for other purposes, entering waters he didn't know as well, dealing with officials in a city where his connections were limited and his language skills inadequate. The cargo was still aboard, the wool and iron sitting in the hold generating no profit while the ship made this humanitarian detour that benefited no one financially, that risked everything for people Matteo didn't know, would likely never see again after dropping them at Constantinople, who couldn't repay his generosity in any material way that would justify the cost and delay and risk he was accepting. When news of this decision reached the other crew, the original Santa Lucia sailors who signed on for a quick profitable run to Alexandria, the reaction was mixed. Some understood and supported their captain's choice, recognizing that they might someday need similar mercy if their own ship was attacked, that creating a culture of mutual aid served everyone's long-term interest even when it cost in the short term. Others were furious, calculating lost wages from the delayed return, resenting the additional mouths consuming their provisions, questioning why they should sacrifice for strangers when the sea offered enough danger and hardship without voluntarily taking on more. Matteo held firm. He was captain, his word was law aboard ship, and he had made his decision. They would deliver the survivors to Constantinople. They would do it with as much grace and generosity as circumstances allowed, and anyone who had serious objections could find new employment when they reached port. The voyage to Constantinople tested everyone. The additional people strained provisions that had to be rationed more strictly. The trauma the Byzantine survivors had experienced, the loss of friends and crewmates to pirate violence, created emotional weight that pervaded the ship. Cultural and linguistic differences that might have been minor irritations became major friction points in the stress and crowding and constant awareness that every day of delay meant lost profit, meant investors growing angry, meant reputations being damaged in markets that valued reliability above almost everything. But something else happened too, something unexpected and ultimately more important than the economic cost. The two crews, forced together by circumstance rather than choice, began to function as a single unit. The Byzantine sailors, grateful and determined to prove their worth, worked harder than paid crew normally would. The Genoese sailors, watching men who had lost everything continue fighting for survival, found their own complaints and fears put in perspective. The shared work and shared danger and shared meals created bonds that crossed the cultural and political divisions that normally separated Genoese from Byzantine, Catholic from Orthodox, Italian from Greek. By the time Santa Lucia reached Constantinople 6 weeks after the original encounter, the ship had become something different from what departed Genoa. It was no longer just a Genoese merchant vessel with hired crew pursuing profit. It had become, temporarily but genuinely, a community bound by shared experience and mutual dependence, a demonstration that different peoples could not just coexist, but actively support each other when circumstances demanded it, and leadership chose cooperation over calculation. The Byzantine authorities, hearing the story of Matteo's choice, granted Santa Lucia extraordinary trading privileges, waived the usual fees and restrictions, helped him find cargo for the journey home that would partially offset his losses. More importantly, they sent official letters to Genoa and Venice and other Italian cities, describing what Matteo had done, holding him up as an example of the kind of merchant the Byzantines wanted to trade with, creating a reputation that would benefit him for the rest of his career. When Santa Lucia finally returned to Genoa 4 months after departure, 2 months late, Matteo faced angry investors demanding explanations for delays and losses. But he also faced a city that had heard the story, that recognized something important had happened, that this voyage had demonstrated possibilities that the normal commercial calculations ignored. The church praised him. Other captains, men who had made similar choices and been punished for it, felt vindicated. Young sailors heard the story and imagined themselves making similar decisions, choosing honor over profit, humanity over efficiency. The voyage didn't change maritime law or business practices or the fundamental economics of Mediterranean trade. Ships still sailed for profit, merchants still calculated costs and benefits, captains still made decisions based on what served their immediate interests. But it changed something subtler, and possibly more important. It created a story that circulated through the maritime community, that provided an example and a challenge, that asked everyone who heard it to consider what they would have done, what they should do when faced with similar choices between the easy path and the right path, between serving investors and serving something larger than profit. That voyage became the turning point not because it revolutionized anything immediately, but because it revealed what was possible, what medieval people were capable of when they chose to be, what kind of society could exist aboard ships if captains had the courage to create it and crews had the generosity to sustain it. It proved that the multicultural cooperation evident aboard many ships wasn't just pragmatic tolerance, but could be something deeper, more intentional, more humane, a glimpse of possibilities that the medieval world mostly failed to achieve, but that ships and sailors occasionally demonstrated in moments like Matteo's choice, in decisions that cost everything in economic terms but earned something more valuable, something that survived in memory and story long after the profits and losses of that particular voyage were forgotten. The immediate consequences of Matteo's choice rippled outward from that single voyage, like waves from a stone dropped into still water, touching lives and changing trajectories in ways no one could have predicted when Santa Lucia departed Genoa on what should have been a routine trading run. For Matteo himself, the financial impact was severe and immediate. His investors, calculating lost revenue from delayed arrival and missed market opportunities, sued him in Genoese commercial courts, demanding compensation for profits they claimed his unauthorized detour had cost them. The legal battle dragged on for 18 months, consuming time and money Matteo couldn't afford, threatening to destroy the reputation he'd spent 2 decades building, forcing him to mortgage his house and borrow from family to cover legal fees and settlement payments. The court ultimately ruled against him, finding that a captain's authority didn't extend to changing contracted routes for humanitarian purposes, that his duty to investors superseded his impulse toward mercy, that however admirable his motives might be personally, they constituted breach of contract professionally. He was ordered to pay damages that took him 3 years to satisfy, years when he couldn't get financing for new voyages, when his name became associated with unreliability rather than heroism, when the maritime community that had initially celebrated his choice gradually forgot or moved on to newer stories and more pressing concerns. But while Genoa's commercial establishment punished him, something else was happening in the broader Mediterranean maritime world. The Byzantine authorities, grateful for his treatment of their citizens, granted Matteo trading privileges in Constantinople that other Genoese merchants didn't enjoy. They reduced his port fees, expedited his customs clearances, introduced him to Byzantine merchant families who became valuable partners, effectively creating a monopoly advantage in Byzantine trade that partially offset his losses from the original voyage and the legal settlement. More subtly, but perhaps more importantly, the story of his choice spread through the network of sailors and merchants and ship captains who constituted the real maritime community, the people who actually lived the life rather than just financing it from comfortable homes in port cities. Among these men, Matteo became a legend, an example of the kind of captain other captains wanted to be, the kind of man whose name meant something beyond profit margins and successful voyages. When experienced sailors had choice of which ship to join, many chose Matteo's, willing to accept slightly lower wages to serve under a captain they respected, creating a crew quality and loyalty that proved invaluable in the dangerous, unpredictable work of medieval maritime trade. For the Byzantine survivors Matteo rescued, the consequences were equally profound but more immediately positive. They returned home as men who should have died, who were presumed lost by families that had begun mourning them, who walked through familiar streets like ghosts returned from the dead. Several of them became merchants themselves, their gratitude to Matteo translating into business relationships that benefited both parties, creating trading networks that connected Genoa and Constantinople in ways that previously hadn't existed. One of the survivors, a young Greek named Constantine, who had been a junior sailor on the lost Byzantine ship, was so affected by Matteo's example that he devoted his life to maritime rescue and assistance, eventually founding a charitable organization that maintained supply stations at dangerous points along major trade routes, places where damaged ships could find food and water and basic repair materials without cost. The organisation survived Constantine's death, continued operating for nearly a century, saved countless lives, all traceable back to the moment when Matteo chose to help rather than pass by. But the consequences weren't uniformly positive. The commercial court's ruling against Matteo created legal precedent that other courts referenced in similar cases, establishing firmly that captains who deviated from contracted routes for humanitarian purposes could be held financially liable, that mercy had to be subordinated to commercial obligation, that the emerging maritime commercial law valued predictability and profit over compassion and flexibility. This precedent influenced decisions for generations, created a chilling effect where captains who might have wanted to help vessels in distress thought twice about the legal and financial consequences, calculated whether they could afford to be generous when the law might punish them for it. The investors who sued Matteo, while they won their case and received their settlement, found themselves facing unexpected social consequences. The Genoese public, having heard the story and largely sided with Matteo, viewed these merchants as men who put profit before humanity, who were technically right but morally wrong, whose victory in court was a loss in the court of public opinion that mattered in a society where reputation and social standing affected business relationships. Some of them found their other business ventures suffering as people chose to work with different merchants, as their names became associated with heartlessness, as the price of their legal victory proved higher than the settlement they collected. The crew of Santa Lucia scattered after the voyage, some staying loyal to Matteo through his legal troubles, others finding employment elsewhere, but all of them carrying the memory of what they'd experienced, what they'd witnessed, what it felt like to be part of something larger than a commercial transaction. Years later, men who had served on that voyage told the story to younger sailors, described the decision Matteo made and the consequences that followed, used it to illustrate moral complexity, to show that doing the right thing didn't guarantee reward, that sometimes you paid a price for choosing honour over profit, but that the price was worth paying because some things mattered more than money. In Constantinople, the story took on political significance. Byzantine officials, engaged in delicate negotiations with Genoa over trading rights and territorial disputes, used Matteo's example to argue for closer cooperation between the two powers, to demonstrate that individual acts of courage and compassion could bridge political and religious divides, that the Mediterranean world benefited when mutual assistance replaced mutual suspicion. The argument had limited impact on the actual negotiations, which ground forward according to their own logic of power and interest, but it created a cultural reference point, a shared story that diplomats on both sides could invoke, a small piece of common ground in an otherwise contested relationship. The story also reached beyond the Mediterranean. Pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem heard it and carried it to northern Europe, where it appeared in sermons and moral instruction, usually simplified and sanitized, transformed from the messy, complicated reality into a tidy parable about Christian charity and divine reward. These versions often omitted the legal consequences Matteo suffered, the financial hardship, the years of struggle to recover, presenting instead a false narrative where virtue was immediately rewarded, where doing good guaranteed material success, missing entirely the point that Matteo's choice was meaningful precisely because it cost him, because he did it anyway, knowing the price he'd pay. Maritime insurance practices evolved partly in response to the legal precedent Matteo's case established. Insurers began offering policies that specifically covered losses from humanitarian assistance, allowing captains to help distressed vessels without personal financial liability, transferring the cost to a system that could absorb it more easily than individual captains could. This innovation, while motivated by profit rather than altruism, made the seas marginally safer for everyone, created incentives for mutual assistance that the earlier system had accidentally discouraged. The deeper consequence, harder to measure but possibly most significant, was the conversation Matteo's voyage started within the maritime community about what obligations captains and crews had beyond commercial contracts, what kind of society they wanted to create on the sea, what values they would uphold when upholding them was expensive and difficult. This conversation didn't produce immediate policy changes or new regulations, but it created awareness, made people think about questions they might otherwise have ignored, planted seeds that would grow slowly across generations into cultural shifts that made the Mediterranean maritime world gradually, incrementally, marginally more humane. Not every consequence was positive. Not every ripple created improvement. But the voyage proved that individuals could matter, that single decisions could change trajectories, that the choice one captain made on one ship on one day could influence hundreds of other choices made by hundreds of other people across decades, creating consequences that spread far beyond anything Matteo imagined when he ordered Santa Lucia to change course and take Byzantine survivors aboard and sail to Constantinople instead of Alexandria, choosing the harder path because it was the right path, paying the price without regret, creating a legacy that outlived him and outlasted the legal judgment against him, and became part of the shared memory of a community that defined itself partly through stories like his, partly through the aspiration to live up to examples that showed what the best of them were capable of when circumstances demanded it, and courage didn't fail. To understand how medieval merchant ships and the people who sailed them shaped our modern world requires looking beyond individual voyages and dramatic stories to see the larger patterns. The slow accumulation of changes that transformed the Mediterranean from a barrier between civilizations into a highway that connected them, that made possible everything from Renaissance art to modern global trade. The most obvious impact was economic. The creation of trading networks that moved goods across vast distances with increasing reliability and efficiency, that allowed specialization and comparative advantage to develop in ways that enriched entire regions. Northern Italy grew wealthy, not because it had natural resources, but because it sat at the junction of Mediterranean sea routes and Alpine passes connecting to northern Europe, because Venetian and Genoese merchants mastered the art of moving goods between these different trading zones, taking profits from the markup while providing genuine value through the service of making distant products locally available. These trading networks required infrastructure that changed the physical landscape of the Mediterranean world. Ports expanded from simple beaches where boats could land into massive engineered harbours with deep water anchorages, protective breakwaters, specialised facilities for loading and unloading different types of cargo, warehouses and customs houses, and all the buildings and equipment necessary to handle the volume of trade that successful routes generated. The investment in port infrastructure represented enormous capital, money that came from profits generated by maritime trade, that was justified by expectation of future trade growth, that created employment for thousands of workers who built and maintained and operated these facilities. Shipbuilding became a major industry in its own right, employing craftsmen whose specialized knowledge was valued and protected, creating guilds and training systems that preserved techniques across generations, developing standardization and quality control that made ships more reliable even as they became more complex. The forests that provided timber, the rope walks that produced rigging, the sailmakers and blacksmiths and all the supporting industries that supplied shipyards. These created economic ecosystems that sustained entire communities, that made coastal cities wealthy from the maritime trade they serviced. But the economic impact went deeper than just creating industries and infrastructure. Maritime trade fundamentally changed how medieval people thought about commerce, risk, profit, and economic organization. The development of maritime insurance created financial instruments that spread risk across multiple parties, that allowed ventures to be undertaken that no single merchant could afford alone, that pioneered concepts of pooled investment and shared liability that would eventually evolve into modern corporations and stock markets and the entire apparatus of global capitalism. Banking systems developed partly to serve maritime trade, to provide the credit and currency exchange and long-distance money transfer that merchants needed to operate across multiple kingdoms and currencies, to avoid the danger and inefficiency of shipping actual coins when letters of credit could accomplish the same purpose more safely and flexibly. The Medici and other great banking families built their fortunes largely on servicing maritime trade, on providing the financial infrastructure that made complex multi-party transactions possible across vast distances. The cultural impact of maritime trade was equally profound, though less immediately visible. Ships carried not just goods, but ideas, techniques, artistic styles, philosophical concepts, religious texts, scientific knowledge, all the intangible products of human creativity that moved along trade routes, that were exchanged and adapted and transformed in the process. The Renaissance happened partly because Italian merchants brought back from the East manuscripts and artworks and architectural ideas that had been lost or unknown in Western Europe, that sparked renewed interest in classical learning and classical aesthetics, that provided models and inspiration for artists and scholars who created what we now recognize as one of history's great cultural flowerings. Mathematical and navigational knowledge developed through maritime trade had impacts far beyond shipping. The need to calculate cargo values, insurance premiums, profit margins, currency exchange rates drove development of commercial arithmetic and accounting practices that became foundations of modern mathematics. The navigational challenges of crossing open water without reliable landmarks pushed development of astronomical observation, celestial navigation, and eventually the scientific instruments and mathematical tables that made possible the age of exploration and everything that followed. Linguistic and cultural exchange happened wherever merchants from different backgrounds met and traded. Port cities developed polyglot populations where multiple languages were spoken, where cultural synthesis created hybrid forms that borrowed from multiple traditions, where people learned to navigate between different cultural contexts with a flexibility that inland populations rarely developed. This cosmopolitan culture, born in medieval Mediterranean ports, created models of multicultural urban life that would eventually spread globally. The legal impact of maritime trade created foundations for international law and commercial regulation that still influence modern practice. Maritime law codes developed in the Middle Ages established principles about contracts, liability, insurance, salvage rights, and dispute resolution that were sophisticated and pragmatic, that balanced competing interests fairly enough that parties from different legal traditions could accept them, that created predictability and standardization essential for trade to flourish across political boundaries. Modern international commercial law traces its ancestry directly back to these medieval maritime codes that were forged through necessity and refined through practice. The political impact was subtler but significant. Maritime trade created economic interdependence that gave competing powers reasons to cooperate despite political and religious differences, that made maintaining trade routes a priority that sometimes outweighed territorial ambitions or ideological conflicts. The Crusades disrupted but never destroyed Mediterranean trade because all parties, Christian and Muslim and everyone between, recognized that commerce served everyone's interests in ways that war rarely did. This pragmatic recognition that mutual economic benefit could coexist with political hostility created patterns of interaction that moderated conflict and created space for diplomacy and negotiation. Technologically, maritime trade drove innovation in ship design, navigation, cargo handling, and all the supporting technologies that made trade more efficient and reliable. The incremental improvements in ship construction, the gradual development of better sails and rigging and steering mechanisms, the slow refinement of navigational techniques, these accumulated over centuries into vessels and practices that could eventually cross oceans rather than just seas, that made possible the voyages of discovery that connected Europe to the Americas and Asia in ways that transformed world history. The environmental impact of medieval maritime trade was limited compared to later industrial-scale shipping, but still significant. The demand for ship timber contributed to deforestation around the Mediterranean, particularly in regions with accessible forests near shipyards. The introduction of new crops and animals through trade routes, sometimes deliberate but often accidental, changed agricultural patterns and ecological balances. The spread of diseases along trade routes, the famous example being the Black Death which travelled partly by ship, demonstrated the dark side of increased connectivity, the ways that networks that spread goods and ideas also spread pathogens that killed millions. Perhaps most fundamentally, medieval maritime trade changed how people understood their world, expanding mental horizons beyond local communities and immediate regions to encompass the broader Mediterranean world and eventually beyond. Merchants and sailors who had seen distant cities, who had dealt with different cultures, who had experienced the diversity of human civilization, returned home with broadened perspectives that couldn't be erased, that they shared through stories and examples that gradually expanded their community's sense of what was possible, what existed, what the world contained beyond the narrow confines of local experience. The medieval merchant ship, that cramped dangerous wooden vessel that killed so many who trusted their lives to it, was ultimately a vehicle for transformation, for connection, for the exchange of everything that makes civilizations rich and complex and creative. The sailors and merchants who climbed aboard despite the dangers, who kept trying despite the casualties, who maintained the trade routes through wars and plagues and political upheavals, These people created the networks that bound the Mediterranean world together, that laid foundations for the global connected civilization we inhabit now, that proved human courage and persistence, and the desire to connect across distances and differences could overcome barriers that seemed insurmountable, could create something larger and more valuable than the sum of individual voyages and individual profits, could shape the world in ways that echo still across the centuries that separate us from them. Behind the statistics and trade routes and historical impacts were individuals, human beings with names and stories and hopes and fears, people whose lives unfolded in the narrow confines of wooden ships crossing dangerous waters, whose voices mostly vanished but occasionally echo across centuries in fragments of letters and legal testimony and the rare personal accounts that survived. Consider Marco, a sailor from a fishing village near Genoa, illiterate and poor, who signed aboard merchant ships because farming his family's tiny plot of rocky land couldn't support a wife and the children he hoped to have. He was 23 when he made his first voyage to Alexandria, terrified and exhilarated, vomiting over the side for the first 3 days until his stomach finally adjusted to the ship's constant motion. He learned to climb the rigging despite his fear of heights, to haul ropes until his hands bled and calloused, to sleep in cramped quarters that stank of unwashed men and bilge water and the 1,000 odours that accumulated in a working ship's belly. Marco survived 7 voyages before his luck ran out on the 8th, a winter crossing to Tunis when storms caught them 2 days from port, when waves broke over the deck and swept 3 men overboard, including Marco, who had an instant to realise what was happening before the cold water closed over him, and the ship sailed on because stopping was impossible, because the living had to prioritise their own survival, because the sea claimed its due, and you couldn't argue or negotiate or do anything but accept and remember, and try not to dwell on the fact that it could have been you, probably would be you eventually if you stayed at sea long enough. Or think about Rachel, a Jewish merchant's daughter from Barcelona, who accompanied her father on a trading voyage to Constantinople when she was 16, the year 1289, travelling partly for business education but mostly because her father didn't trust partners to handle certain negotiations, wanted family present to protect family interests. She kept a diary during the voyage, one of the very few such documents to survive, describing the fear and wonder of watching land disappear behind them, the strangeness of being the only woman aboard among 30 men, the awkwardness of maintaining modesty and dignity in conditions that afforded neither, the seasickness that plagued her for weeks, the dolphins she watched racing the bow, the terror of a storm that convinced her they would all die, the relief when Constantinople's walls finally appeared on the horizon. Rachel's diary revealed details that official sources never mentioned, the small daily struggles that consumed so much energy and attention. Where to relieve herself on a ship where privacy was impossible, how to wash when fresh water was too precious to waste on bathing, how to manage menstruation aboard ship, how to handle the constant attention from crew members who saw her as exotic curiosity or opportunity or threat, how her father had to maintain careful balance between protecting her and not showing weakness that might invite disrespect or worse. She wrote about the other passengers, pilgrims heading to Jerusalem who spent their days in prayer and their nights arguing theology, a Greek merchant who spoke 7 languages and told stories of travels that stretched from England to Persia, a wounded crusader returning home with infected sword wound that worsened daily despite the ship surgeon's best efforts, a couple with 3 small children who somehow maintained family routines and dignity despite the chaos around them. She described the crew's rough kindness, how sailors who seemed crude and frightening became protective once they understood she meant them no harm, how they saved her portions of better food when rations were distributed, how they made small gestures of respect that acknowledged her presence without making it uncomfortable. Rachel's voyage ended successfully. She reached Constantinople and conducted business and returned home, and eventually married and had her own family. But she never forgot those weeks at sea, never stopped feeling gratitude that she survived when so many didn't, never quite felt completely safe on land again because she'd learned viscerally how fragile safety was, how thin the boundary between life and death, how much depended on luck and wind and the skill of men you barely knew but had to trust completely. Then there's Giovanni, a ship captain from Venice, who left behind letters to his wife spanning 30 years of maritime career, letters filled with longing and frustration and the constant tension between duty and desire. He described missing his children's childhoods, knowing them only through his wife's letters, arriving home to find them grown and changed and almost strangers who had learned to live without him, who had a father more in theory than practice. He wrote about the guilt of leaving his wife to manage everything alone, the household and finances and child-rearing and all the responsibilities that should have been shared, but fell entirely on her because he was always at sea, always chasing the next cargo, the next profit, the next voyage, that might finally earn enough that he could retire and stay home and know his family. But Giovanni also wrote about the pull of the sea, the way that after a few weeks on land he'd start feeling restless, confined, eager to get back aboard ship despite knowing the dangers, despite the separations, despite everything he was missing at home. He tried to explain this to his wife, how the sea called to something in him that land couldn't satisfy, how he felt most alive when sailing toward distant horizons, how the fear and danger and harsh beauty of maritime life gave him purpose and meaning he couldn't find elsewhere. His letters revealed the impossible tension between love of family and love of the sea, how he was torn between two lives that couldn't be reconciled, how he disappointed people he cared about no matter which choice he made. Consider also Ahmed, a Muslim navigator from Alexandria, who hired aboard Christian ships regularly, despite the religious tensions and occasional outright hostility, who possessed knowledge of North African ports and coastal waters that made him invaluable to Italian captains attempting trades in that region. He appears in multiple ships' records, always hired for specific routes where his expertise was needed, always paid premium wages that reflected his value, but also always temporary, never part of permanent crew, never fully integrated into the Christian maritime community despite his essential contributions. Ahmed left no personal writings that survived, but he appears in others' accounts, described sometimes with respect, sometimes with suspicion, always as slightly foreign, slightly other, never quite belonging even though he spent more time aboard Christian ships than many Christian sailors. One Venetian merchant who employed him described his navigation as almost supernatural, his ability to read weather signs and ocean conditions, to know exactly where they were when land hadn't been sighted for days, to find harbours in darkness that Christian pilots would have missed. But the same account also described Ahmed's isolation aboard ship, how he prayed alone, ate separately, maintained distance even while working closely with the crew, how his expertise earned respect but not friendship, how being essential didn't mean being accepted. There was also young Thomas, a cabin boy from Marseille who went to sea at age 11 because his widowed mother couldn't feed all her children, who learned the maritime trade through brutal apprenticeship that treated him as barely human, a servant to be ordered around, beaten when he was slow or clumsy, given the worst food and hardest work and no respect from anyone. He survived somehow, grew up aboard ships, eventually became a sailor himself and later a mate, carrying scars physical and emotional from those early years, remembering the casual cruelty and occasional unexpected kindness that marked his introduction to maritime life. Thomas's testimony in a legal case provided rare insight into the lowest level of shipboard hierarchy, the boys and unskilled labourers who did the dirtiest, most dangerous work for minimal pay, who were considered expendable, whose deaths rarely merited more than brief notation in ship's logs. He described being sent to clear clogged bilges in the ship's deepest, foulest spaces, working in darkness and stench that made him retch, knowing that if he fell or got stuck, no one would notice until he was dead. He described meals that consisted of wormy biscuit and spoiled meat, sleeping on deck in rain and cold because there was no room for him below, injuries from handling rough rope and heavy cargo that never fully healed because you couldn't rest, couldn't take time to recover, had to keep working or be thrown off the ship at the next port without pay. Yet Thomas also described moments of beauty, watching stars wheel overhead in patterns he learned to recognize, seeing sunrise paint, calm water in colours he had no words for, feeling the satisfaction of mastering difficult work, earning grudging respect from older sailors who had treated him like dirt, but eventually acknowledged he'd become competent, capable, worthy of being called a sailor rather than just a boy doing sailor's work. Each of these voices and thousands more that left no record represented a complete human life, hopes and dreams and fears and daily struggles, people who climbed aboard medieval merchant ships for reasons ranging from desperation to ambition to simple need for employment, who faced dangers that killed substantial numbers of them, who somehow kept going despite everything, who created through their collective effort the trade networks and cultural connections that shaped the medieval Mediterranean world and echo forward into our own time. They weren't heroes, most of them, weren't exceptional or remarkable by any objective standard. They were ordinary people doing difficult, dangerous work because that's what life demanded. Because the alternatives were worse or non-existent, because the sea offered possibilities that land denied even while it threatened to kill them. Their voices, faint and fragmentary across centuries, remind us that history isn't just great events and powerful people, but also the accumulated daily choices of countless individuals whose names we'll never know, whose stories mostly vanished, but whose lives mattered, whose courage and persistence and simple human endurance created the world we inherited. Not everyone benefited from Mediterranean maritime trade, and not everyone accepted its expansion and the changes it brought to traditional economies and social structures. The opposition came from multiple directions, for different reasons, taking forms ranging from violent resistance to quiet economic competition to moral and religious condemnation. The most dramatic opposition came from pirates, men who preyed on merchant ships rather than sailing them, who built entire economies around capturing vessels and cargo, enslaving crews, and disrupting the trade routes that enriched port cities and merchant families. Mediterranean piracy wasn't random violence but organised business, operating from bases in North Africa, the Greek islands, the Dalmatian coast, anywhere that offered good harbours, limited government control, and access to profitable shipping lanes. The pirates were themselves diverse and complex, not simple villains, but people responding to limited opportunities and the enormous wealth moving past their shores on ships they could never afford to own legitimately. Some were former sailors who had been cheated or abused by merchants and captains who turned to piracy as revenge and alternative employment. Others were coastal villagers who couldn't survive on fishing and small farming alone, who supplemented legitimate work with occasional raids. Still others were professional naval fighters employed by one kingdom to harass another's shipping, privateers whose attacks were technically legal under their sponsoring state's authority, even while victims experienced them as simple piracy. The most successful pirate operations were based in North Africa, operating from ports like Algiers and Tunis, under the protection, or at least tolerance, of local Muslim authorities who took their cut of captured cargoes and slaves. These pirates developed sophisticated intelligence networks, spies in Christian ports who reported ship departures and cargo values, informants who identified the richest targets, advance warning that allowed pirate fleets to position themselves along routes where merchant ships were most vulnerable. Christian merchant ships fought back through multiple strategies. Some sailed in convoys, multiple vessels travelling together for mutual protection, able to defend themselves against smaller pirate forces though still vulnerable to major attacks. Others hired armed guards, soldiers who travelled aboard specifically to fight off pirates, expensive but sometimes necessary for high-value cargoes. The wealthiest merchants sometimes employed their own warships to escort trading vessels, creating private navies that blurred the line between legitimate trade and piracy themselves. But military responses only addressed symptoms, didn't solve the underlying economics that made piracy profitable and attractive to people with limited alternatives. As long as enormous wealth moved across the Mediterranean in vulnerable wooden ships, as long as coastal populations remained poor while merchant families grew rich from trade they controlled, the incentive structure favoured piracy regardless of risks and military opposition. Resistance to maritime trade also came from landowners and traditional agricultural elites, who saw their social and economic position threatened by the rising merchant class. In many medieval societies, status and power came from land ownership, from ancient families with deep roots, from relationships based on feudal obligation rather than commercial contract. Merchants represented a different kind of wealth and power, based on money rather than land, on trade rather than agriculture, on connections that crossed borders rather than deep local roots. This tension produced various forms of opposition: legal restrictions on merchant activities, sumptuary laws that limited what they could wear or own regardless of wealth, social snubbing that kept them from positions of political power even when they had enormous economic influence. In some cities, old aristocratic families literally battled in the streets with newly wealthy merchant families, factional violence that reflected deeper conflicts about who deserved power and status, what kind of society the Mediterranean world was becoming, whether traditional hierarchies would survive or be replaced by money-based meritocracy that rewarded commercial success regardless of birth. Religious opposition came from multiple directions and motivations. Some churchmen condemned merchants as greedy, motivated by profit rather than piety, corrupted by wealth and comfort into forgetting spiritual priorities. They preached against usury, against the lending and investment practices essential to maritime trade, against the accumulation of wealth beyond what was needed for modest living, against the entire commercial economy that was transforming medieval society. These preachers found receptive audiences among people who felt left behind by economic changes, who saw merchants growing wealthy while traditional craftsmen and farmers struggled, who needed explanations for why the world seemed to be changing in ways that didn't benefit them. But religious opposition was more complex than simple condemnation. Some monasteries and churches were themselves deeply involved in maritime trade, owning ships and lending money, and participating fully in the commercial economy they supposedly opposed. The cognitive dissonance between religious ideals and economic reality created endless theological debates about what activities were acceptable, what constituted legitimate profit versus sinful greed, where the line should be drawn between necessary commerce and excessive wealth-seeking. Muslim religious authorities face similar tensions, trying to reconcile Islamic teachings about trade and fair dealing with the reality of piracy and the enslaving of Christian merchants and crews. Some scholars condemned these practices as violations of Islamic law. Others justified them as legitimate acts against infidels. Still others took pragmatic positions that acknowledged the complexity and avoided absolute judgments, recognizing that religious ideals often conflicted with economic and political realities. Local populations in port cities sometimes resisted foreign merchant communities that established themselves to facilitate trade. Venetian and Genoese trading colonies in Constantinople, Acre, Alexandria, and other cities created ethnic enclaves with their own laws, their own churches, their own defense forces, essentially foreign territories within host cities. Local residents often resented these privileged foreigners who controlled lucrative trades, who lived by different rules, who seemed to drain wealth from the host economy while contributing minimal benefits to local populations. These resentments occasionally exploded into violence. The massacre of Latins in Constantinople in 1182 saw thousands of Italian merchants and their families killed by mobs angry at their economic dominance and political influence. Similar violence erupted in other cities during periods of tension. Foreign merchant communities attacked and expelled, their goods confiscated, their privileges revoked, only to be slowly restored as economic necessity overcame political anger, and governments recognized they needed the trade these merchants facilitated. Guild opposition came from craftsmen and local merchants who competed with imported goods, who saw their markets undercut by foreign products that arrived by ship, who watched customers choose cheaper or higher quality imports over locally made items. They pressured governments to impose tariffs and restrictions, to protect local industries from foreign competition, to limit the power of long-distance merchants who seemed to benefit at everyone else's expense. These protectionist impulses conflicted with consumers' interest in accessing better or cheaper goods, creating political tensions that governments tried to balance through complicated systems of regulation and taxation. Environmental opposition emerged from communities affected by the maritime trade's resource consumption. Forests near major shipbuilding centres were systematically harvested for ship timber, creating deforestation that affected local economies dependent on wood for fuel and construction, that changed landscapes and reduced resources available to traditional users. Coastal communities watched their waters depleted of fish, as merchant ships employed ever larger crews that needed feeding, as port cities grew and demanded more seafood, as fishing shifted from subsistence to commercial enterprise trying to keep up with urban demand. Some opposition was simply conservative resistance to change, people who wanted the world to stay as it was, who feared the disruptions and uncertainties that came with expanding trade and cultural contact, who retreated into tradition and local identity as defense against forces they couldn't control. This opposition rarely stopped maritime trade but created friction and delay, made changes slower and more contested than they might otherwise have been, preserved some traditional practices and local autonomy that unchecked commercial expansion might have eliminated entirely. The opposition to Mediterranean maritime trade in all its forms reflected genuine concerns and legitimate grievances, even when it expressed itself through violence or reaction or religiously motivated condemnation. The maritime trading economy did concentrate wealth in certain hands, did disrupt traditional social hierarchies, did create winners and losers, did change cultures and communities in ways that benefited some while harming others. Understanding the opposition, taking seriously the perspectives of those who resisted rather than dismissing them as backwards or reactionary, reveals the complexity of medieval economic and social change, shows that progress for some meant loss for others, that the Mediterranean world that maritime trade created had costs as well as benefits, victims as well as beneficiaries. The ships kept sailing despite all opposition, the trade kept growing, the networks kept expanding, but not without resistance, not without conflict, not without people fighting to preserve or protect or maintain things they valued against the transformative force of maritime commerce that was remaking their world, whether they wanted it remade or not. That resistance shaped how trade developed, limited its worst excesses sometimes, forced compromises that might not have happened otherwise, ensured that the maritime Mediterranean world emerged from struggle and negotiation rather than simple inevitable expansion, that its final form reflected contested choices rather than predetermined outcomes. Somewhere in the transformation from dangerous, desperate voyages to established, profitable trade networks, something unexpected happened, something that transcended pure commerce and became cultural awakening, a flowering of knowledge and art and human creativity that the ships themselves helped enable, carrying more than cargo in their holds, carrying the seeds of Renaissance that would bloom across the Mediterranean world and eventually reshape Western civilization. It started gradually. Merchants bringing back manuscripts from Constantinople and Alexandria, ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been lost in Western Europe but preserved in Byzantine and Arab libraries, works of philosophy and mathematics and medicine and literature that revealed how much knowledge had been forgotten, how much wisdom the classical world had possessed that medieval Europe had lost or never known. These manuscripts, purchased as curiosities or investments or genuine intellectual treasures, circulated among scholars who could read Greek and Latin, who recognized their significance, who began the patient work of translation and commentary and integration of classical learning into medieval thought. The impact was transformative. European scholars discovered Aristotle through Arabic translations and commentaries, learned mathematics and astronomy from texts originally written in Greek or Sanskrit and preserved through Muslim scholarly networks, encountered medical knowledge that revolutionized understanding of human anatomy and disease. The ships that carried these manuscripts were transporting intellectual wealth more valuable than any cargo of silk or spices, though the merchants who moved them often didn't fully understand what they carried, saw books as merchandise rather than revolutionary ideas. But ideas once encountered couldn't be unencountered. Knowledge once revealed couldn't be suppressed or forgotten, and the classical learning that arrived by ship began transforming European intellectual life in ways that eventually produced universities and scientific method and the entire apparatus of Western scholarship. The University of Bologna, the University of Paris, Oxford and Cambridge, these institutions emerged partly because Mediterranean trade made available the texts and ideas that created demand for systematic study and teaching, that convinced people knowledge was worth pursuing for its own sake, not just for immediate practical application. Artists travelled along trade routes, carrying styles and techniques and aesthetic ideas that cross-pollinated between cultures. Byzantine icon painters influenced Italian religious art. Arab geometric patterns appeared in Spanish and Sicilian decoration. Chinese silk designs were copied and adapted by European weavers who couldn't import enough actual silk to meet demand. The ships carried not just finished artworks but artists themselves, craftsmen seeking employment, apprentices studying techniques, masters commissioned to work in distant cities where their skills commanded premium prices. The artistic awakening that trade enabled went beyond simple copying or cultural borrowing. It created synthesis, hybrid forms that combined elements from multiple traditions into something new and distinctively Mediterranean. Venetian architecture incorporated Byzantine domes and Islamic pointed arches, alongside Western European structural elements, creating buildings that belonged to no single tradition, but represented the mixed culture of a port city that looked east and west simultaneously. Sicilian mosaics blended Norman, Byzantine and Arab aesthetic principles into unified artworks that were somehow greater than the sum of their influences. Music travelled aboard ships as well, instruments and notation systems and actual musicians moving between ports, carrying songs and styles and theoretical knowledge about harmony and rhythm and musical structure. The lute arrived in Europe from the Arab world, transforming European music by providing new harmonic possibilities. Notation systems developed to preserve and communicate music across distances, to allow compositions created in one place to be performed accurately in another, creating the beginnings of what would become Western classical music tradition. Culinary knowledge crossed the Mediterranean in ships' holds and cruise memories, recipes and ingredients and cooking techniques that transformed European cuisine. Sugar from Egypt and the Levant, rice from Muslim Spain, new spices and preparation methods that created dishes unknown to earlier generations, that made food more varied and interesting and complex. Cookbooks began appearing, recording recipes and techniques in writing for the first time, creating culinary literature that preserved and transmitted knowledge that had previously passed only orally from cook to apprentice. Medical knowledge benefited enormously from maritime contact between cultures with different healing traditions. Arab physicians had preserved and expanded classical Greek medical knowledge, had added their own observations and theories, had developed surgical techniques and pharmaceutical preparations unknown in Christian Europe. When this knowledge arrived via shipborne texts and travelling physicians, it revolutionized European medicine, introduced systematic approaches to diagnosis and treatment, created the foundations of medical education that would eventually lead to modern scientific medicine. Technological exchange happened constantly along trade routes, craftsmen observing techniques in foreign workshops, merchants reporting innovations they'd seen, objects themselves revealing through careful examination how they were made. Paper-making technology travelled from China through the Islamic world to Europe, eventually revolutionizing record-keeping and enabling the spread of literacy by making writing materials cheaper and more available. Compass technology, though its exact origins remain disputed, spread through maritime use, transforming navigation and making longer voyages safer and more reliable. The cultural awakening that maritime trade enabled wasn't just about importing knowledge and techniques from elsewhere. It was also about the stimulus that contact and competition provided to local creativity. Italian merchants, exposed to Byzantine and Islamic artistic achievement, wanted to match or exceed it. Commissioned artworks that would demonstrate their sophistication and wealth created demand that pulled artists to greater ambition and achievement. The competition between Venice and Genoa, between Florence and Siena, between rival merchant families within cities, created cultural arms races where art and architecture became ways of asserting status and power, where beauty served political and economic purposes while also being valued for its own sake. Universities and libraries grew from this cultural ferment, institutions dedicated to preserving knowledge and training new generations of scholars. The Great Library in Alexandria had been destroyed centuries earlier, but new centres of learning emerged in Cairo, Baghdad, Cordoba, and eventually in European cities enriched by maritime trade. These institutions collected manuscripts, supported scholars, created communities of learning where knowledge could accumulate and be systematically organised and taught, where intellectual work became a recognised profession rather than something pursued only by isolated monks or amateur enthusiasts. Translation became a crucial profession, scholars who could read multiple languages working to make texts available across linguistic boundaries, creating the infrastructure of knowledge exchange that allowed ideas to spread more widely and rapidly than ever before. The translation movement in medieval Spain, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked together to translate Arabic and Hebrew texts into Latin, was enabled and sustained by the wealth and cultural contact that maritime trade created, by the understanding that knowledge was valuable regardless of its source, that wisdom could cross religious and cultural boundaries if people were willing to learn from each other. The cultural renaissance that ships helped create wasn't confined to high culture and elite pursuits. Popular culture changed too, stories and songs and folk traditions mixing and evolving through contact between different populations, creating hybrid forms that enriched everyone's cultural repertoire. The merchant sailors themselves were vectors of cultural exchange, carrying songs they'd heard in distant ports, telling stories of strange customs and remarkable sights, bringing home small objects and ideas that gradually transformed local cultures in subtle, cumulative ways. This awakening, this flowering of creativity and knowledge and cultural achievement, was made possible by the ships and the brave or desperate or ambitious people who sailed them, who maintained trade routes despite dangers, who connected civilizations that might otherwise have remained isolated and ignorant of each other's achievements. The golden age of Mediterranean culture in the late Middle Ages happened because merchants and sailors created the networks that allowed ideas and art and knowledge to flow across vast distances, because the same vessels that carried mundane cargoes of grain and wine also carried manuscripts and instruments and artists, and all the intangible wealth that makes civilizations rich in ways that transcend mere economics. The ships that seemed so crude and dangerous that killed so many who trusted them, that appeared to serve only commercial purposes, turned out to be carrying something more precious than any cargo manifest recorded, carrying the seeds of cultural transformation that would eventually produce Renaissance humanism, scientific revolution, the entire modern world with all its knowledge and achievement and ongoing creative ferment. The sailors who climbed aboard those vessels pursuing profit or fleeing poverty couldn't have imagined the larger significance of their voyages, couldn't have known they were participants in cultural transformation that would echo across centuries, but their courage and persistence made it possible nonetheless, created the connections that allowed human creativity to flourish in ways it never could have in isolation. After examining the evidence, following the voyages, understanding the people and the opposition, and the cultural flowering and all the complexity of medieval maritime life, we arrive at a truth that challenges our fundamental assumptions about the era, about the people who lived it, about what was actually possible in the 13th and 14th centuries, despite everything we thought we knew. The revelation is this, that medieval Mediterranean merchant ships were laboratories of modernity, spaces where the future was being invented by people who had no idea they were inventing anything, who thought they were simply doing difficult, dangerous work to earn a living or make a profit or survive another day, but who in the process were creating social and economic and cultural patterns that would eventually define the modern world. This wasn't their intention. They had no grand vision of transforming civilization, no conscious plan to revolutionize commerce or create multicultural communities or develop the financial instruments that would become global capitalism. They were responding pragmatically to immediate challenges, solving problems that confronted them, adapting to circumstances that demanded flexibility and innovation whether they wanted to innovate or not. But their solutions, their adaptations, their pragmatic choices accumulated into something transformative. Consider the social organization aboard ships. Medieval society on land was rigidly hierarchical, based on birth and status and religious affiliation, with strict boundaries between different groups, elaborate rules governing who could interact with whom and how. But ships couldn't function that way. The work was too demanding, and the dangers too constant to allow the luxury of social rigidity. So ships developed their own social logic based on competence and reliability, and the simple fact that everyone's survival depended on everyone else doing their job correctly, regardless of who their parents were or what god they prayed to. This was revolutionary, even though it seemed like simple common sense to the people doing it. A social organization based on merit and function rather than birth and religion, where a Muslim navigator could command respect from Christian sailors, where a Jewish merchant could form partnerships with Catholic traders, where the lowborn could rise through demonstrated ability. This prefigured the modern world's supposed commitment to meritocracy and opportunity in ways that medieval land-based society couldn't or wouldn't match. The economic innovations that maritime trade required were equally revolutionary. The development of insurance, of joint stock ventures, of complex contracts that specified rights and responsibilities and risk allocation in precise detail, of banking instruments that allowed money to move across vast distances without physically transporting coins. These created the infrastructure of modern capitalism centuries before anyone used that term or had a theory about what they were creating. Medieval merchants didn't sit down and invent capitalism, they responded to specific problems. How do you manage the risk that ships sometimes sink? Create insurance systems that spread that risk. How do you finance voyages too expensive for any individual? Pool resources from multiple investors. How do you pay for goods purchased in distant ports without carrying vulnerable coin shipments? Develop letters of credit and banking networks. How do you ensure that contracts will be honoured across political and cultural boundaries? Create legal frameworks and enforcement mechanisms that transcend individual jurisdictions. Each solution was pragmatic, designed to address immediate needs, but collectively they created something unprecedented, an economic system that could operate across vast distances, that could coordinate complex activities involving hundreds of people who would never meet, that could calculate and manage risk with increasing sophistication, that could allocate resources efficiently toward profitable ventures while protecting participants from catastrophic losses. The cultural impact of ships as spaces where different traditions met and mixed was equally revolutionary, even though participants might not have recognized it. Medieval society on land could maintain cultural and religious separation relatively easily when communities rarely interacted, when most people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, when encounters with foreign cultures were rare and brief. But ships forced sustained intimate contact between people from different backgrounds, created situations where they had to communicate and cooperate, and find ways to live together in close quarters for weeks or months. The tolerance and pragmatism this required, the ability to set aside prejudices and focus on shared goals, the experience of discovering that people you'd been taught to fear or despise were actually just humans trying to survive and do their work and get home safely. This created a cosmopolitan culture that challenged medieval assumptions about the natural order of society and the inevitability of conflict between different groups. Ships proved that multicultural communities could function, that diversity wasn't inherently threatening, that people from different backgrounds could work together successfully when circumstances demanded it, and when leadership created structures that made cooperation possible. This wasn't idealism or progressive politics, it was practical necessity, but it demonstrated possibilities that would eventually, slowly, with enormous resistance and many setbacks, lead toward the more pluralistic society we claim to value now. The revelation goes deeper still. Medieval people are often portrayed as limited by their era, constrained by religious dogmatism and feudal hierarchies and technological primitiveness, unable to imagine or create alternatives to the world they inherited. But the evidence from merchant ships shows this is false, shows they were as capable of innovation and adaptation and practical problem-solving as any humans in any era, that they created sophisticated solutions to complex challenges, that they built systems and institutions and cultural practices that worked remarkably well given the constraints they faced. The ships themselves were technological marvels, wooden vessels built without computer-aided design or advanced mathematics or any of the tools we consider essential for engineering. Yet they functioned reliably enough to sustain trade networks spanning thousands of miles. They survived storms and combat and years of hard use. They were maintained and repaired and kept operational through accumulated knowledge and skilled craftsmanship that we've largely lost and struggle to fully understand. The navigation that allowed ships to cross open water without GPS or reliable charts or any of the instruments we consider necessary was equally sophisticated in its own way, representing accumulated knowledge and careful observation, and systematic thinking about celestial mechanics and ocean currents and weather patterns, a science that wasn't written down in formal treatises but was nonetheless rigorous and effective and continuously refined through experience. The deeper truth is that medieval people were not inferior to us in intelligence or capability or potential. They were simply working with different resources and different knowledge bases and different social structures, but within those constraints they were every bit as creative and adaptable and capable of remarkable achievement as modern humans. The ships prove this. The Voyages prove this. The cultural and economic transformation they created proves this. Understanding this changes how we should think about historical progress, challenges the comfortable narrative that we're so much more advanced than our ancestors, reveals that the medieval people who built those ships and sailed them and created the trading networks that connected civilizations were our equals in every way that matters, that they gave us gifts we haven't fully acknowledged, lessons we haven't completely learned, examples of courage and creativity and human possibility that deserve recognition and respect, rather than the condescension that characterizes so much historical writing about the medieval era. The ships that seem so primitive, that we might dismiss as crude and dangerous and barely functional, were actually sophisticated solutions to difficult problems, were platforms for social and economic innovation, were vehicles for cultural transformation, were proof that humans in any era can rise to challenges, can create something remarkable from limited resources, can build toward futures they can barely imagine, through the accumulated effect of countless individual choices and efforts, and moments of courage when everything argued for giving up, or accepting defeat, or settling for less than what seemed possible. That's the deepest revelation. That the medieval Mediterranean merchant ships, and the people who sailed them were showing us what humans are capable of when we face challenges honestly, when we adapt to circumstances practically, when we create systems that work rather than systems that conform to ideological purity, when we judge people by their competence and character rather than their birth or beliefs, when we pursue connection and communication and cooperation across differences, because the alternatives are isolation and ignorance and the poverty that comes from refusing to learn from anyone different from ourselves. The ships were teaching lessons their own era mostly failed to learn, lessons we're still struggling with now, lessons about how to create societies that work, that function, that allow different people to coexist and cooperate and create together something better than any of them could create alone. Medieval merchant sailors and merchants figured this out not because they were progressive or enlightened, but because they had to, because the sea demanded it, because survival required it. And in the process, they showed what's possible when necessity forces us past our prejudices and assumptions and comfortable divisions. That revelation, that uncomfortable truth, that mirror held up to show us that people we thought inferior to us were actually modelling solutions to problems we still haven't solved. That's what emerges from careful study of medieval maritime life, what the evidence reveals when we look at it honestly, what those long-dead sailors and merchants and all the forgotten people who climbed aboard wooden ships and trusted their lives to wind and skill and hope have to teach us if we're willing to listen across the centuries and acknowledge what they achieved and how much we've yet to match their example. Sit with this for a moment, let the weight of it settle, the recognition that the medieval world we thought we understood, that we imagined as distant and foreign and fundamentally different from our own, was actually grappling with the same essential human questions we face now, finding answers we might learn from if pride didn't prevent us from acknowledging that people 8 centuries dead might have wisdom we lack. The courage required to board a medieval merchant ship, to trust your life to wooden planks and hemp rope and the skill of a captain you might barely know, to sail away from everything familiar toward horizons that might hide fortune or disaster, with equal probability. That wasn't so different from the courage required to navigate our own uncertain world, to make choices despite incomplete information, to trust systems and institutions and other humans when trust could be betrayed, when the outcomes remain unknowable until you've already committed beyond the point of safe return. Medieval sailors couldn't know if their ship would survive the voyage, couldn't predict storms or pirates or the 1,000 ways the sea could kill them, but they sailed anyway because staying safe in port meant poverty and stagnation, meant missing whatever opportunities lay beyond the horizon, meant choosing certain limitation over uncertain possibility. We face similar choices constantly, different contexts, but the same essential question of whether to risk or retreat, whether to trust or surrender to fear, whether to engage with an uncertain future or cling to the insufficient security of the known and familiar. The multicultural cooperation that ships required, that pragmatic tolerance born from shared danger and common purpose, speaks to our own struggles with diversity and difference. Our difficulty creating societies where people from different backgrounds can coexist peacefully and work together productively. Medieval ships proved it's possible when necessity demands it, when survival depends on it, when leadership creates structures that make cooperation beneficial for everyone involved. But they also proved how hard it is to sustain that cooperation once necessity recedes, how quickly people revert to prejudice and division when circumstances allow it, how fragile and contingent tolerance can be when it's based on pragmatism rather than deeper conviction. We haven't solved this problem any better than medieval society did. We've just changed which differences we tolerate and which we weaponize, which boundaries we cross and which we reinforce, what kind of diversity we celebrate and what kind we suppress. The ships showed that humans can transcend division when they choose to, when circumstances force them to, but the broader society that surrounded those ships showed how rarely that choice is made, how much easier it is to retreat into comfortable sameness than to engage with uncomfortable difference. The economic systems that medieval maritime trade developed, those proto-capitalist mechanisms for managing risk and allocating resources and coordinating activity across vast distances, created wealth and connection and opportunity, but also concentration of power, inequality, exploitation, all the problems that plague modern capitalism because they're inherent in systems that prioritize efficiency and profit over equity and human welfare. Medieval merchants weren't evil for creating these systems. They were solving real problems, finding ways to make trade work at scale. but their solutions embedded assumptions and structures that we're still grappling with, still trying to reform or replace or at least moderate into something more humane. The environmental costs of medieval maritime trade, the deforestation and resource depletion and ecological disruption that accompanied commercial expansion, prefigured our own environmental challenges, showed that humans in any era struggle to balance economic activity with environmental sustainability, that the impulse to extract resources and maximize short-term benefit often overwhelms longer-term thinking about consequences and limits. Medieval society didn't have the tools or knowledge to fully understand what they were doing to their environment, but we do. We have no excuse for continuing patterns that medieval people could perhaps be forgiven for not recognizing as destructive. The tension between individual ambition and collective welfare, between private profit and public good, between what serves the merchant or ship captain and what serves the broader community, that tension ran through medieval maritime trade and runs through our own economy. Unresolved then, unresolved now, perhaps unresolvable except through constant negotiation and struggle, and the effort to balance competing values that can't be perfectly reconciled, but must somehow coexist if society is to function at all. Think about the forgotten voices, the Marco and Rachel and Ahmed and Thomas and all the nameless thousands whose labour built the trading networks, but who received minimal share of the wealth they created, who died young or lived hard, diminished lives while merchants and ship owners grew wealthy from their work. Their situation wasn't so different from modern wealth inequality, from systems that concentrate rewards at the top while distributing risk and hardship broadly, that claim to be meritocratic while actually preserving and amplifying existing hierarchies. It lives in the questions their lives raise, the challenges their example presents, the discomfort we feel recognizing that people we thought inferior to us were in some ways superior, that the society we think of as backward had developed solutions to problems we're still struggling with, that the medieval world has lessons for the modern world if modern pride and modern arrogance don't prevent us from acknowledging what we might learn. Tonight, somewhere in the Mediterranean, ships are sailing, moving cargo between ports in patterns that echo routes established centuries ago, following courses that medieval captains pioneered, connecting markets that medieval merchants created. The sailors aboard those modern ships don't think about their medieval predecessors, don't feel connection to the past, don't realize their continuing traditions stretching back across centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience and courage. But the connection exists whether recognized or not. The legacy persists whether acknowledged or not. The medieval maritime world shaped our present in ways we mostly don't see, but that reveal themselves when we look carefully at how we organize commerce, how we think about trade, how we balance risk and reward, how we create communities across difference, how we navigate between familiar and foreign, safe and dangerous, certain and unknown. The Mediterranean remembers in the lap of waves against harbour stones that watch ships arrive and depart for 800 years, in the wind that filled medieval sails and fills modern ones, in the stars that guided ancient navigators and shine still overhead, though we mostly ignore them now, preferring GPS and electronic charts to celestial observation and accumulated wisdom. It remembers in the blood and bone of descendants, in the cultural DNA of institutions and practices and ways of thinking that trace back to medieval merchants and sailors who didn't know they were founding anything, who thought they were just doing difficult work for understandable reasons, pursuing profit or survival or simple employment, making voyages that seemed ordinary at the time but accumulated into transformation that reshaped the world. And it remembers in the human heart, in the part of us that looks toward horizons and wonders what lies beyond, that wants to explore and connect and risk and try, despite the dangers, despite the casualties, despite all the sensible reasons to stay safe in port and accept limitation, rather than venturing toward possibility that might be fortune or disaster, but that calls to something essential in human nature, something that medieval sailors felt just as strongly as we do, that drove them aboard wooden ships to cross dangerous waters toward uncertain futures, that drives us still toward whatever horizons call in our own time. The legacy of medieval merchant ships crossing the Mediterranean is the world we inherited, the possibilities we assume, the connections we take for granted, the global civilization that began when someone first looked across the water and imagined reaching the other side when someone first built a vessel and trusted it to carry them beyond sight of land, when someone first dared to believe that distance could be crossed and difference could be bridged, and the unknown could be faced and survived and transformed into the known. That legacy lives as long as we remember, as long as we honour the courage it took to sail into uncertainty, as long as we learn from both the achievements and failures of people who came before us, who faced their challenges as we face ours, who built toward futures they couldn't fully imagine, who left us inheritance we haven't fully appreciated, who deserve recognition not as primitive ancestors we've surpassed, but as humans who showed what humans are capable of when courage doesn't fail, and hope survives, and the choice is made to risk rather than retreat, to sail rather than surrender, to trust in possibility despite every reason to expect disaster. The Mediterranean still remembers, and as long as we remember too, as long as we tell these stories and learn these lessons and acknowledge the debt we owe to people, whose names we'll never know, but whose efforts shaped everything we inherit, the legacy endures, the connection persists, the medieval merchant ships and the extraordinary humans who sailed them remain alive in memory and meaning, teaching us still if we're willing to learn, challenging us still if we're willing to accept the challenge, showing us still what humans can achieve when we try, what worlds we can build when we don't give up, what futures we can create when we sail toward them, despite all the dangers, all the uncertainties, all the sensible reasons to stay safe in port and accept that the horizon is as far as we can go.